Welcome to Inner and Outer Worlds.
What's up, bitches? Welcome to Inner and Outer Worlds. I'm Zach. This is Jordan. And whoo-wee! Woo! Do we have a fucking episode for you today about the book Alien Information Theory. And this book is written by Andrew Gallimore. Andrew Gallimore is a computational neurobiologist, pharmacologist, chemist, and now author. So this book is about how DMT is a technology likely designed by other beings, whether those are alien beings or spiritual beings or some sort of intelligence outside of our third dimension. I know it's pretty out there stuff today, guys. Beings from other dimensions designing a compound to be put in almost all living things, all plants, all animals, ourselves included. And it's apparently released when we die. A lot of people have called DMT the spirit molecule. DMT stands for dimethyltryptamine. It is produced by one of our amino acids. And anyways, so the agenda for today, guys, while we break this all down for you, we're going to get into information and rule-based systems and how the flow of information can transport us from the world that we find ourselves in now to the DMT world or worlds of other dimensions. This is not the only reality switch compound that we have on Earth, but it is a very important one and a very organic seeming one because it is, like I said, in all living things. Then we're going to get into cellular automata and how those programs update and how our reality is likely programmed very similarly to that, and how complexity can come from very simple rules, and you hit run on the program and this complexity forms in many ways. We'll talk about that. We'll also talk about how the brain is constantly creating worlds all the time, whether we're awake or dreaming or under the influence of a psychedelic drug. Our brain is always doing its part in making sense of the outer information coming in, but also in things like dream states, it doesn't need any outer information whatsoever. It's just always generating a world, always generating something, essentially to keep our mind busy, to keep us entertained, and that's just how we're programmed. So we'll get into that. Then we'll get into how DMT affects the brain. We'll talk about how other psychedelics affect the brain in general and which receptor sites these compounds bind to. And then we'll get into how DMT may be a gateway to the other dimensions of hyperspace, meaning the other dimensions of our reality at large.
Okay. Yes,
so,
Zach.
With all that said, I got my man Jordan over here. He's going to talk about information and rule-based systems, and he's got a good example that makes it easy for us to digest a little here.
Okay, so before we get into it, just quickly, I want to say most of this book is very sound mathematical modeling and computational theory. The wacky step is this like DMT gates information from higher dimensions. So that's like the big bold claim that isn't necessarily like validated or verified. Like this is the hypothesis. This is the alien information theory that the book title states. So for most of the book that we'll be describing, this isn't like conjecture. This is quite sound computational science. So just to set that as a preface for what we talk about. Do you want to add anything on that front?
It sounds wild no matter what a person's belief system is, but I think after we say what we're about to say in this episode, it will be very much implied that that is what's going on. both of us haven't fully, of course, jumped to that conclusion because more evidence and maybe more experience is needed from us doing more DMT and actually breaking through. For example, myself, I've done ayahuasca once, 5-MeO DMT once, and NN DMT once, and in none of those occasions did I ever break through. So
Yeah.
I think experience is going to be the best experiment to navigate these realms, and certain things like prolonged onset of DMT through programs like DMTX are going to be pioneers in humanity discovering this stuff and really knowing what's going on. And of course the science that will back that, and hopefully that we can quantify the things that people experience better and better as humanity evolves.
Yeah.
But for now,
So
this is going to be an episode very much implying that there are other dimensions bringing in information to this reality through reality switch technologies like psychedelics.
yeah. All right, let's get into it. So,
All right, my man.
so information can generally be defined as being generated when a system selects between a finite number of states. So what that means is that if a system has the access to some set of states, let's say you have a chessboard or a checkers board, whatever you're used to, and you have a grid of 8 by 8 squares. If you have a chessboard, you can see that there's 64 total squares. So if I ask you, Zach, to guess what square I'm thinking of, what do you think is the best strategy to do that? Maybe you know because you read the book and this is in there, but so you one
I
out
probably
of
read that chapter like a year ago.
Yeah,
but
so this is
is the
good
book
then.
that it took me a year to finish.
This is good. So so I've picked one out of the 64 squares.
What's my best guess?
Yeah, like
You want
so
me to
you,
guess?
how many like so yeah, try to guess what's
Based on the rules of chess,
No, just
I guess.
No, it doesn't have to be
random
chess.
wild
It's
guess.
just 64 squares. Yeah.
I don't know. I might go for a multiple of 8 if it's 8 by 8. I don't know. I
Okay.
don't know what my
Yeah.
logic
So
would be.
your first guess is just random, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So you've picked randomly, and I say no. That's not the square I'm thinking of. Do you pick the square beside it? Do you? This strategy of just picking a random square is not quite the best strategy. The best strategy you can do is to ask me a question, a yes or no question of, is the square on the left side of the board? And I would say yes or no. So you've gained, in that case, one bit of information. You've gained the answer to a yes or no question. So I say yes, it's on the left side of the board. You still don't know what square it is, but now you say, is it on the top half or the bottom half? Or sorry, you say, is it on the top half? I say no. So now you know it's on the bottom half. You've gained another bit of information. You've learned a yes or no answer to a question. So you can keep doing this. So because there's 64 squares on a chessboard, the most questions you'll have to ask me is 6 questions. 6 yes or no questions. Each time you half the chessboard. You narrow down from these 64 possible states down to one guaranteed final state. And we say as a result, you've gained 6 bits of information. So information can be thought of as the answer to a series of yes or no questions. When you have a computer program, so I'm sure most people know your computer thinks in ones and zeros, but what does that mean? So those are information bits. Each transistor in your computer is coding a yes or no question. It's coding a 1 or 0, and what that means is the transistor at a positive voltage or at 0 volts? So again, there's many ways to state this. Like, is it on or off? Is
Active,
it yes or no?
inactive.
Active, inactive,
Yeah.
positive voltage, 0 voltage. Like, these are all yes, no. We call it binary, where there's 2 options. Your computer basically does all of its computations very fast, but they're all, at the end of the day, yes or no questions. And that's the information. So if you have a music file, which is like 3 megabytes, every byte is 8 yes or no questions. So every byte of data is 8 bits. So 8 ones or zeros or some combinations of them. So when you have a 3 megabyte file of music, what that means is that you need 3 million times 8, because there's 8 bits in a byte. You need 3 million times 8, so 24 million yes or no questions to describe this song.
Holy shit.
So what information is saying is that our brain is processing that essentially that 24 million yes or no questions to generate the song that you hear in your head. We'll talk about how information is transformed from different states, but
that's literally what's happening for me to play a Spotify song.
Yeah, so on your
phone.
computer, your computer doesn't hear the song. Your computer doesn't have ears. It doesn't know what the song is. All it knows is that I need to put these certain bits in my hard drive at 1 or 0, and that will perfectly describe the song when I say send it to a friend or send it over the radio or play it in your earphones.
That's fucking wild. Yeah.
So this is the essence of it, is that this is what information is essentially, is that it's the answer to a yes or no question. And you can say that information is generated when a system such as a chessboard selects between a finite number of states. So there was 64 states, which, if you want to get a little mathy, is 2 to the power of 6. So 2 times 2 is 4, times 2 is 8, times 2 is 16. Another times 2 is 32, times 2 is 64. So you raise 2 to the power of 6, and the power on the 2 is the number of bits that you need to describe that system. So this chessboard is 2 to the 6 states, or a 6-bit system. So you need 6 yes or no questions to perfectly describe where on the chessboard I've selected. So this comes close to entropy. We'll have like full episodes on entropy, but if you've heard of the term entropy, it's related to the amount of uncertainty in your system. And you can say that information is the opposite of uncertainty. So when I first asked you this question, you were completely uncertain. Your entropy was high. But when I told you the answer, your entropy was reduced. You gained information.
Gained certainty through information.
You gained certainty through information by selecting from a finite number of states. So this is very core to the next topic that we'll get into. Did you want to give your examples of information processing, or do you have some questions on that?
No, that was a really good example, and I like what you brought up with the music, with the megabits. It was like, I've never thought of that many questions needing to be answered for a single song or a single movie to be played on a computer, for example. Yeah. But it makes sense because there can be so much drastic difference in what a song is, or what images are shown in a movie, and for just ones and zeros to be the code, and the computer just saying yes or no to a bunch of different options. Obviously there need to be millions and maybe billions for a movie answer.
Yeah. So I'll just give you another example, is that when you look at an image, there's a bunch of pixels. So let's focus on one pixel. That pixel has 3 channels of color. So it has a red channel, a green channel, and a blue channel. And each of those channels has 8 bits of information needed to describe its color value. So 8 yes or no questions, more or less, are needed to be asked to say, like, for instance, let's look at the red channel.
Oh, like red, blue, green, red, blue, green, and then red and blue, or red and green?
No, not quite. Let me just finish this, then you can ask. Because I don't want to be confusing here. So let me. Okay, so just focus on the red channel of the pixel.
Okay.
I'm asking, how red is this pixel? So what I would ask is it in the upper half of redness, or is it in the lower half of redness? And then then depending on that answer, you'd ask 7 more questions, and that narrows it down to exactly how red the pixel is. So the red channel has 0 to 255 values of redness.
What?
Yeah, so on a computer, if you look up like on Paint the RGB value of a pixel, it tells you like this pixel was 156 amount of red and 64 amount of blue and 24 amount of green or whatever. So that perfectly describes the color of the pixel. But how did we get there? We had to select from a finite number of states, which is 0 to 255. And that gives you one exact number, which was, I forget what I said for red, and just now like 150 or something.
You said 255.
Well, that's the range, 0 to 255. But there's a specific value it has. Each pixel has a specific value from 0 to 255. Let's say it's 150. For me to know what the value is, I would have to ask 8 questions to narrow it down. So basically what I'm saying is each pixel in your image has 8 bits of information describing red, 8 bits of information describing the green color, and 8 bits of information describing the blue color. So in total, each pixel has 24 bits needed to perfectly define that pixel's color. And then you have a million pixels on your image. You have 24 bits times a million. And then that tells you how much storage you need to put into your computer to store that image. So what's in your computer is not the image. What's in your computer are the answers to those yes or no questions. So that when you portray that image on a screen, something translates those yes or no questions back onto screen lights. So it tells each pixel of your screen to light up the amount that you want each pixel to light up.
Mm.
So this is already getting into information processing, where we translate the yes or no questions into like some light value, for instance.
So what you're saying is there's data backing what is perceived.
Yeah, exactly. So this is the digital information aspect of what we're going to get into.
Mm.
So hopefully that's clear. Do you have questions about that? I feel like it would be good to get it out of the way before.
No, it's just fascinating. It's very cool.
It's awesome. We can have full like, oh no. Okay. We could basically have full episodes on computational theory and information and all sorts of stuff like this. But let's go on with what our agenda is.
The reason we're getting into information so deeply, guys, is because it is very much related to what we're going to talk about and how we are able as human beings to gate information from other dimensions potentially into our brains, and how we're able to perceive completely different worlds while still being here in our bodies. Everything from technology to biology is information flow, or in other words, data transfer, or you can say energy transfer. But essentially, everything's always transforming from one unit to another in order to be perceived by us. That's essentially how we process information. So this is mostly related to the book. I just thought it was fascinating to talk about how vision works and how hearing works. We'll talk about how the data transfer happens in both of these senses, and then we'll get into the rest of this book here. But so we'll start by saying information from the Google Dictionary definition is what is conveyed or represented by a particular arrangement or sequence of things. Everything is information, because when you think about it, essentially every single thing is either an arrangement or a sequence of things, right? We all got that. Arrangements can also be called systems, and sequences can be called transfers of data. All of these are synonymous with each other: arrangement, sequence, system, information, data transfer. Reality is just a series of data transfers of information, which we could also call energy transfers, with each bit of energy or data relating to the next in some way. So, in terms of vision and how that works, light photons from the sun hit an object and then bounce off of that object towards your eyeball. Your cornea on the outer surface of the eye sharpens the light to make the object more clear. Your iris, the colored part of your eye, controls the size of your pupil. The larger your pupil, the more light comes in. The smaller your pupil, the less light comes in. This is why pupils dilate in the dark and contract in bright light. The next step is for the light data to pass through the lens of your eye so you can see things even clearer. With your lens flattening when you're looking far away and bending when you need to see up close. The light then travels through the back of the eye, passing through the retina on the back wall of the eye, which contains about 130 million cells, some of which are rods and cones, which are sensitive to light. These cells turn the photons into electrical signals that fire through your optic nerve, which is basically a cable connecting your eyes to your brain. The retina creates a rough image, but it sees the world upside down. It's your brain that turns what you see right side up. Your brain also combines each eye's input into bifocal vision. Your brain also adds a ton of detail to your vision, so you can see complex shapes, movement, depth, and a spectrum of colors. Your brain also matches what you see to something in your memory bank that your brain already knows, so you can distinguish what's what. All of this is information travel from where we started with the sun's light hitting an object to the final memory match that your brain does to identify what something is.
Mm-hmm.
That's fascinating to me.
Yeah.
That's cool. Do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, I think like one thing that's interesting is like, I think it's called aphasia, where people don't recognize faces. So like if I have 2 oranges and a banana, like my brain is already doing the mapping from the sensory data and arrangement of those into like, oh, that looks like a face. Or like if you look at a cloud and something looks like a face, it's like our brain is doing this bias to preferentially see faces. But some people don't have that functioning. So they'll see the sensory data of 2 apples and a banana, or oranges, I forget what I said.
2 oranges and a banana, yeah.
But they're some, I don't know the exact reasons, but their brain doesn't have that bias or that recognition
it doesn't associate it to faces.
Yeah, it doesn't have that information processing step to take that sensory information and call that a face or something. So it just kind of we'll get into this in a lot more detail in a bit here, where our brain is building a world model. So it's not just that we are a video camera seeing exactly what's out in the world. Our brain ultimately has the final say of what our reality is being experienced as.
Mm-hmm.
So,
which explains things like, just hearing that, it explains how people who are experiencing schizophrenia or Alzheimer's or dementia, their reality that they're perceiving is actually real for them. It's not that they're like they're actually or they're actually perceiving reality in ways that are different than everyone else. Their intrinsic data is completely different from the intrinsic data we are experiencing.
But it's fully valid in that the world that they live in is real. It's
real for them.
Yeah, exactly. So
yeah, we'll get more into that, and hopefully that will help it land more.
Okay, let's hear about ears.
Ears, okay, hold on.
Or hearing.
One thing I wanted to point out before that. So there is countless amounts of data or information flying around at all times. This data is constantly being transferred from place to place all the time. The reason we perceive the data we do is because we are attuned to perceive what we see. Whether you accredit our tuning of data of which we perceive, whether you credit it to evolution, to our own sense of focus, or to some higher power, or a combination of all three, we are living a very specific experience here because of how we are attuned and what information is making it through to our conscious minds. Okay, so how hearing works. I want to use the example of talking on a cell phone because that's pretty common. So cell phones are like radios. They transmit and receive radio signals to and from a network consisting of low-powered radio antennas and transmitters arranged in certain geographical locations referred to as cells, also known as cell towers. If you're moving in a car while on the phone, your cell phone signal is transferred from cell tower to cell tower. Each tower is connected to a mobile switching center. Signals are passed from the phone to the antenna of the cell towers and sent through the switching center, where they can either be relayed to another cell phone or converted into a signal that allows you to reach landlines. When you speak into the phone, it all begins by air entering your lungs with an inhale. So let's think oxygen data. And on the exhale, the partial closing of your vocal cords meeting your exhale airstream creates a vibration of sound waves, which is sound data. The microphone of your phone converts the sound waves of your voice into electrical signals by moving a physical membrane called a condenser. The condenser's movements, kinesthetic data, imprint a sonic impression into an electrical signal, or electrical data, which is then converted back into sound by reversing this process on the other end of the signal path, or the other person's cell phone, through that cell phone's speaker. The speaker of the other phone contains several parts to turn this electrical data back into comprehensive auditory data. The electrical signals pass through what's called a voice coil, a coil of copper wire within the phone that creates a magnetic field, electromagnetic data, moves a magnet through magnetism, which then strikes a thin piece of plastic in your phone called a diaphragm that moves back and forth up to thousands of times per second, creating sound waves that will enter your ear as auditory data. Now, getting into our biology and how we hear that auditory data. So, when those sound waves enter our ear, they hit the eardrum, making it vibrate, which in turn vibrates 3 tiny bones within the ear. These bones amplify and increase the sound vibrations, and those vibrations then pass through to the cochlea, a snail-shaped membrane in our ear full of fluid. The vibrations make the fluid ripple and make the cilia hairs within that moving fluid move too. Each cilia hair cell is responsible for a specific tone of frequency, or frequency. As these cilia hair bundles are moved, ions at the top of the hair cells create a rush of chemicals or neurotransmitters to pass from the bottom of the hair cells, binding to the auditory nerve cells that are awaiting them at the other end of the synapse. These neurotransmitters or chemicals received by the auditory nerve cells create an electrical signal, which then travels along the auditory nerve to the brain. That exact same process is happening right now as we speak to you on this podcast. That shit is crazy. That is such a long process from
nature solves it all as it does. It just does it instantly. Like,
That's
it doesn't
right.
have to think about it. Once the data processing streams are set up, that's the only thing nature can do.
Yeah.
It necessarily behaves that way. So it's like,
So it's as if the system is designed so that data and information can flow seamlessly through many transformations along the way.
yeah.
From the first inhale that I take to speak the next word, to this whole fucking process, to your brain perceiving this
Well, your
as
brain had
language.
Your brain had to
comprehensible.
dictate how your lungs intake the oxygen and dictate how your vocal cords are being shaped, and
That's right. So I didn't even start from the
you
beginning.
didn't even start from the beginning there. So it's like
That's
there's
the
all
path.
it's all information flow at the end of the day.
Yeah. So everything's always being transferred from thing to thing, and everything is information. That's basically what we're trying to get across here in the beginning preface to this book. Okay. So getting to the book, on page 18, Jordan's going to talk about quantum numbers, which are essentially how our reality does have some form of coding in it, and how
Yes.
it can be a digital background to what we are experiencing by being made of electrons and photons, and protons. And the
And there's
nucleus.
photons too. Yeah, you're
That's
not
right.
wrong.
That's right.
So I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but this is just like we'll get into this in far more detail in the quantum mechanics episodes. But essentially, quantum systems simply need discrete or digital numbers. So, like for instance, in an atom, I don't think we've talked about atoms yet, but we'll keep this simple. Is that
We had a whole episode on it.
Yeah, but we didn't talk about like shell structure and stuff, like quantized, like the quantum atom, which atoms really are. So in an atom, to put it shortly, is that an electron that orbits around the nucleus of the atom, that electron can't just be in any position as it wants or any energy state that it wants. We call this quantization, where the electron has to be in, for instance, energy level 1, or to have what we call a principal quantum number of 1, 2, 3, and so on to infinity. So these are, you could call that digital, is that you can't have the electron in quantum number 1.5 or 1.2. It has to be in number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4.
So it's giving it coordinates essentially.
Yeah, so it's like an energy level, we call them. So these are discrete, they're quantized. There's jumps between each level. It's not like can be smooth transitions. So at some level of nature, which seems to be the most fundamental level of nature, is that there's this fundamental digital aspect to things where that's not the only quantum number. There's, for instance, the azimuthal quantum number, the magnetic quantum number, and the spin quantum number. So if you describe these quantum numbers for an electron in an atom, that uniquely defines the electron. And then other electrons need to take on other combinations of these numbers to be able to fit in the atom. So for instance, the ground state electron in an atom can have principal quantum number 1, and then it can have an azimuthal quantum number of 0, magnetic quantum number of 0, and then a spin can be up or down, so plus 1/2, minus 1/2. And no other electron can be in that exact state. So when you start to fill the shells of an atom, you need to start filling in the other states, which are defined by other sets of these quantum numbers. And we'll get into that in much more detail. But essentially, this gives us the atomic structures that we see, all the elements you've ever heard of on the periodic table. This leads into chemistry, where information transfer between atoms based on rules dictating transitions between states. So by state, I mean like these quantum numbers. There has to be rules followed. So we'll get into rule-based systems, but there has to be a rule followed where anyways, I'm not going to
directs the flow of
there's physical
information.
Yeah, there's physical laws dictating how states can be updated. So this leads into what we're getting into the book, but just know that there's some deep aspect to this that already exists in nature, and then we'll describe more alternative rule-based systems starting now. I don't know, when do you want to get into that?
Almost now.
Yeah.
Essentially, what he's saying is because the subatomic particles behave in ways where they are updating according to rules, it's essentially jumps in from frame to frame. Let's say like in a claymation movie, for example, where you take a picture of the characters in this position, then you take a picture of them in the next position, morphed a little different, and then you can play all those frames in a row so fast that to our eye it looks like a smooth movement of a movie. Mm-hmm. That's essentially how our reality could be programmed too.
Yeah, so that's what we'll get into with the book here now.
Yeah, because that's how digital information flows.
Yeah, it's from state to state,
to state,
from bit to bit. Yeah. So
carry on rule-based systems.
Okay. So the core of this book is rule-based systems. So we talked about chess before. That is a rule-based system. You don't need to know the rules of chess, but if you do, this will maybe help a bit. But for instance, on a chessboard, each person playing has 16 pieces, and there are rules that tell each piece how to update from move to move. So if I'm white, I make the first move. There are rules that...
Does white always make the first move?
Yeah. Yeah. There's some historical
Racist.
racism. Boo.
Boo, hiss. Boo.
Anyways, white makes the first move, and there is a rule. There's several rules. There's basically rules for each piece, and then some like meta rules in the game. But there's rules that tell me the possible update states from the starting position to the next position. So for instance, I can move a pawn up 1 square. I can move a pawn up 2 squares. I can move... There's 8 pawns. You can move all of them like that. You can move your knight up and to the right or up and to the left, and then you have 2 knights. So you can make any of those moves in your first... in my first move. And then I make my move, and then there's a meta rule, we call it, where the meta rule says, now Zach makes his move. So there's a rule that says, I go, then you go, then I go, then you go, then I go, then you go. One could imagine, if I was making a new game of chess 2, coming out soon, that I go twice, then you go twice, and then I go twice. So it seems obvious that I go once, you go once, but one could imagine there's a rule-based system where, no, I go twice, so I'll move a pawn and then a knight, and then you'll move a pawn and then a knight, and then I'll move a bishop. So it doesn't have to be the way that chess was created, but chess was created in almost a beautiful way where there's such a delicate balance of simplicity and complexity that it gives you such a complex yet understandable game that almost anyone, like kids, pick it up when they're like 3 years old and they can understand the rules, but they're going to be trash at it for a while because it takes you a while to ramp up in terms of your understanding of the complexity of these rules. So with simple rules governing the update of this system from move to move, we can get immense complexity where someone like Magnus Carlsen can destroy 20 people that he's playing simultaneously while blindfolded, for instance. Like, I don't know if that specific number of people hasn't been done, but like he's destroyed good players while blindfolded, and it's just like no problem because of the understanding of several aspects of this hierarchical system. But I'm dropping a lot of terms that we'll get into and define. But rule-based systems fundamentally are a set of states or cells. So the chessboard, as we mentioned earlier, has 64 cells or squares. And there are rules which dictate how each cell updates from move to move or from step to step. And this naturally links into our next topic of cellular automata. But is there anything you wanted to linger on a bit with this, Zach? Or is that...
No, perfect example.
Okay.
Okay, so moving on to cellular automata, which is a rule-based system as well, not created by Conway. So cellular automata update with each passing second or move into a new state, and basically they update according to their neighboring cells. So if it's a
let's define here. I'll define what it is from like the ground.
Yeah, okay. Because I was going to get into the game of life, but I feel like we need to define a little more what actual automata is itself.
Okay. So fundamentally, a cellular automata is a you can think of it as like a finite state machine, or like a chessboard, or a grid of squares that can take on certain states. And then, as I discussed, there are rules that dictate how the cell updates from state 1 to state 2 to state 3. And often these rules are based on the neighboring cells. So if you imagine just a line of squares connected, so this is called a 1D cellular automata. So it's just
Right.
a row of squares. Let's say, just to keep it simple, each square can be either on or off at any given state or any given time. So let's say on is white and off is black. There would be rules that say, okay, each cell has two neighbors, one on its left, one on its right. So the rule would be, if the cell is currently on, so if the cell is white and both of its neighbors are black, that in the next step that cell will turn black. So that's a rule that you would make. Another rule would be, if the cell is white or on and only one of its neighbors is black, it will stay on in the next step. So in 1D cellular automata, there are 256 possible rule sets that you can make. So if rule set 1 is analogous to chess, rule set 2 would be chess 2 that I introduced. So you can imagine that rule set 1 dictates how a row of cells will update from step to step. Rule set 2 will have different update rules going from step to step. So the automata, cellular automata, so cellular, each of these squares that can be on or off is the cell, so cellular.
And the automated updates are the automata.
So automata would be like the updating of these cells. So as a whole, it behaves as a system that you give it rules, you give it an initial condition, you hit run, and it just goes. And it's predetermined, and you just you let it go. So the 1D one I described is the simplest, but now you can imagine like a grid in 2 dimensions of little squares. So like if you have graph paper or a chessboard, these are 2D cellular grids. And for a chessboard, for instance, the squares can be white or black. But there's no updating. It's just a chessboard. Like the squares don't change numbers or don't change colors. But on a computer, we can program up like a cellular automata, give it some rules for how to update, and hit run and see what happens. So Zach's going to get into a specific rule set for a cellular automata. So this is called the Game of Life, developed by John Conway, who's a mathematician. Go for it.
Thank you. I could not have explained that any better at all. So very good. Basis of cellular automata, and yes, John Conway's Game of Life. So there are 2 update states, like Jordan said, either active or inactive, alive or dead, whatever you want to call it, white or black, and 4 rules in the Game of Life. So before I get to those 4 rules, the universe of the Game of Life is an infinite 2-dimensional orthogonal grid of square cells, each of which is in one of 2 possible states, like I mentioned, alive or dead. Every cell interacts with its 8 neighbors, which are the cells that are horizontally, vertically, and diagonally adjacent. At each step in time, the following transitions occur. Those transitions are the rules. So rule number 1. If a state is alive and less than 2 of its neighbors are alive, it dies of loneliness. Rule number 2. If a cell is alive and more than 3 of its neighbors are alive, it dies of overcrowding. So anytime it dies, it changes states to the other color. Rule number 3. If a cell is alive and 2 or 3 of its neighbors are alive, it stays alive. So it remains that color.
It's a happy cell.
Rule number 4. If a cell is dead and exactly 3 of its neighbors are alive, it becomes alive, changes colors. Otherwise, it stays dead, remains the same color.
So that sounds pretty basic, right? And for those just listening with audio, I encourage you to just YouTube the Game of Life. You can get a visual. For those on YouTube, we'll have visuals going along with this.
We'll also link the Game of Life in the show notes, so you can click on the YouTube video. There's
Yeah.
an epic video of it
Oh, super epic. Yeah.
with epic music and showing how these updates from these very simple rules can update into a very complex system where there are different seeming life forms that are generated from these 4 simple rules. And
Yeah, you
they
can
interact
see
with each other. They shoot missiles at each other. They do all kinds of crazy shit just with 4 very basic rules.
Yeah. So you don't like all you do with this Game of Life is you set the initial conditions, and by that I mean you turn some number of cells on. Like you make, like me as the programmer, for instance, would go in, click on a bunch of the grid cells, those would be on, and then I hit run because the rules are set, and the game just updates on its own, and you just watch what happens. If I just select the cells randomly, probably not much will happen. Like things will change. I'll see maybe some blobs form and die, some other blobs form and die, but then the
Too
game,
much randomness.
too much randomness and chaos. The game will just fizzle out.
Yeah.
But what I might notice is that, oh, there's something here that's not just random, but seems to be a stable pattern that, for instance, let's talk about the first entity of the Game of Life, which is the glider. So, do we have the glider here? Yeah, so the glider is 5 alive squares that are self-sustaining. So if I set the glider to be on and I hit run, the glider will look, from my point of view, to be moving along the grid in a diagonal direction. I'm perceiving an object moving, but what's really happening is that the cells are stationary. So no cell is moving, but the pattern of information is moving and
Across the grid.
Across the grid. So the grid is fixed, the cells are fixed, the rules are fixed. So it's the pattern of this on and off information that's moving down the grid. So we'll have visuals up on YouTube, and then we'll link off for you to look at these. So the glider is the most basic one, but then you can get all sorts of things. You can get spaceships. You can get spaceships that generate gliders, which are essentially like shooting off these gliders. You can think of gliders as information transfer, like for instance, like photons or light in our world can almost be analogous to those, where the glider can be how components on the grid communicate with one another. So this is just the first entity you might observe on the Game of Life, but Game of Life turns out to be extremely complex. And Zach looks like he wants to say something.
I just want to keep bringing up that we're not just talking about this as it's an interesting program. Like, no, our reality could literally be a 3D grid where we can't see the outlines of each cell, but we're moving through this 3D grid. Our energy field, or whatever you want to call it, our data, our information is moving through this grid, giving us the illusion that we're moving, but really just cells are updating from the subatomic level, on every level up to the atomic level, to the molecular level, to the cellular level, and beyond. That's why this shit is so crazy. That's why.
Yeah, it's like having a 4K TV. You can't see the pixels until you put your eye right up to that thing, and then you see the pixels. Like in our reality, we can't see the grid, but if you zoom in enough, supposedly maybe the grid might be there. This is still being looked into by scientists, of whether fundamentally nature is
digital,
is a grid of things. Like people think space is quantized as a grid. There's a lot of different theories out there, but anyways.
Simulation theory, etc. That's what all this is pointing at, that it could be digital updates of code, moving across some sort of grid. And the best way that we can explain that, because we're living in the 3D right now, we can't look at the whole reality that we're living in right now. So the easiest way to do that is to simulate 2D realities and watch those update, and watch how complex those structures can become by a very simple rule set.
Yeah. And I mean, that's what physics has been doing, whether we think that the universe is digital or analog or whatever. Like physics has been trying to reduce all this complexity we see to a set of simple rules, and you could call those the physical laws. So whether those rules are telling a grid how to update or telling our space-time and quantum fields how to update, at the end of the day, where it really seems like there's a set of rules that dictate how information updates. Again, in the cellular automata, it's from state to state, but in our universe, it's from time point to time point. And again, time might just be an illusion. It might just be states as well, but that there's so many states that we perceive it as continuous, just like we perceive water as continuous. As I described in the atomic theory episode, it's really a bunch of tiny little objects that we don't perceive directly. We perceive the aggregate behavior of it.
That's right. That's really a great point to bring up, how physics is doing its best to identify what these rules are of our physical reality. There's also what we could call metaphysical laws that aren't necessarily quantifiable, but like the law of cause and effect or karma that people, most of the world believes in some way or another, or what goes around comes around. This whole law of attraction fad that many people have different opinions about, but it's not
I have
always
an opinion.
this isn't the time. There's always
we won't get into it.
rules that are defining our lives and defining our experience of our inner and outer worlds.
Think about it too. What decided the laws of physics? Like how are the physics laws decided upon? Like there's got to be some meta rule. It's like, how are the laws of, or the rules of chess defined? Like, okay, someone made it up at some point, or some collection of people.
That's right.
But like, what decided that energy is conserved, or that the electric charge is what it is, or things like that. There's got to be structure beyond this reality. It's like,
that's essentially why this podcast exists.
yeah. There's hierarchies at every level you look. It's like, oh, we've reached the core of reality. It's like, wait a second, something's fishy here. Fuck.
Yeah.
Well, turtles all the way down, man.
The best part about advancing technologically is we can better perceive our reality now and get clues and hints towards how this reality was constructed, because we're now able to construct other realities fairly easily through computation.
Yeah, like look at all the VR and stuff. It's like,
that's right.
Okay, so let's move on. What's the next topic?
So, as Jordan said, complexity arises through the perfect balance of order and chaos. This is how the grid's interactions are able to be sustainable. When too much order is programmed into the rules of a cellular automata program, it soon settles into an unchanging pattern with all cells remaining in the same state. Boring.
Boo.
When too much chaos is programmed into the rules, the automata display a tumult of chaotic behavior that never settles.
Boo, boring.
Oh, crazy, just
crazy.
The same applies to how our universe and life in general is created. We need the perfect balance of order and chaos to exist. So the book says, too little order and life breaks down, but too much and life cannot form. As with other complex systems, life can only exist in that narrow band at the edge of chaos where order and disorder are critically balanced. But life seems like a very special type of complex system, and indeed, life has particular properties that allow us to define it as such. The patterns of information referred to as living organisms sit high within a stack of layers of increasing complexity. At every layer of hierarchically organized complex systems, we can observe emergent behaviors not exhibited by lower levels, with emergent behaviors at one level allowing new, even more complex behaviors to emerge at an even higher level. Life represents the pinnacle of this process of self-organization and the complexification of information taking place on the grid of our universe. Life is a special type of emergent behavior that only appears at the highest levels of organizational hierarchy, built upon many layers of diverse emergent behaviors below it. End quote. So there's something to be said about our need for a balance of order and chaos in our own lives as well. Too much order and we're bored, too much chaos and we long for stability and safety. We also look for a balance of both order and chaos in a romantic partner. It could be because of how we are programmed by the simulation of our reality. Guys. Needing a perfect balance in order and chaos in order to find the proper complexity in our lives that will lead to fulfillment. I connected those dots last night.
Dang. Let's go, Zach. You're cooking. You're cooking, my man. Okay. I like it.
Let that
I like that, yeah.
Let
That's
that
deep.
sizzle for a while.
That's deep.
Moving on though, guys.
Okay, can I talk about
give her.
the so I'm gonna give examples from the book here.
Is this page 46 or not yet?
Yeah, this is
Okay, that was just about to throw it to you.
Okay, sick. Okay. So an example of a complex system that we observe in our, I mean, maybe not day-to-day life, but you might have seen this is flocking of birds, or specifically flocking of starlings. Like if you've seen videos of that where there's thousands of birds and it looks like they're doing some incredibly orchestrated dance in the sky where it's just, have you seen this, Zach?
Hell yeah.
Yeah, I saw this in person in Milan for the first time like last year, and it was, I don't know how people weren't, I mean, there obviously it probably happens a lot there, but like people were just like ignoring it. They had to stop in my tracks and watch these birds flocking. Like it's like this big pattern of black just growing and shrinking and moving as one. It looks like something is controlling it. So that's a very
beautiful
it's an
pattern.
Emergent, complex system that emerges out of simple local interactions. So let me just go through what Gallimore talks about. So anyone who's seen a flock of starlings, called a murmuration, sweeping, twisting, and reconfiguring in elaborate dynamic patterns across an autumn sky, can hardly fail to be astounded by its remarkably intelligent-looking behavior. However, the flock is not directed by any particular starling, and it's likely that individual birds mainly use their closest neighbors' local interactions to direct their movement in the air. Flocking behavior emerges not from the individual birds, but from the interactions between them. Just as there is no society program encoded in every single ant within a colony, flocking is not programmed into the individual birds. The organization of birds into dynamic flocks, or ants into complex societies, emerges from the multitude of rule-based interactions between individual birds or ants. The flock doesn't need to be actively organized by a central organizer. The flock self-organizes. Key point, self-organization. So he gives next here. So he says, from these two examples alone, I didn't talk about the ant example he gives, but it's, you can imagine ants are extremely complex and have complex emergent behavior. From these two examples, we can begin to delineate the essential properties of what are known as complex systems. A complex system is not just a complicated, chaotic, or random system, but one with at least four basic characteristics. 1, many simple components or agents. 2, local, rule-based interactions between agents. 3, no central control. Agents interact locally with their neighbors or when they bump into each other, for example. And 4, and most importantly, self-organization and emergent behaviors. So he goes on, in the case of a flock of starlings, it's easy to spot these 4 features. The flock is constructed from many simple components, the individual starlings. These interact by observing and responding to the position and flight of neighboring birds, so the local interactions. And whilst there is no central bird controlling the flock, the birds self-organize, and the beautifully dynamic behavior known as flocking emerges from the self-organization. Of course, not all types of birds demonstrate this flocking behavior. Self-organization is organization without an organizer, and if the rules are right, order comes for free. But the rules must be right. Not all systems with many interacting components will exhibit complex emergent behavior. And then he goes on to discuss the game of life. So, the game of life, the rules are right. But if you remember the rules, those were four rules, but they have some balance of like, if there's some balance of deactivating the cell and activating the cell.
Yeah.
But you can imagine if all of my rules just deactivate the cell, I'm just going to turn off the whole grid from step 1 to step 2.
Game over.
If all of my rules are to turn on the cell no matter what, that's boring. Like everything turns on, nothing happens. So you need some balance of things, and if you tip the scale in one direction too much or the other direction, then it doesn't behave in a very interesting way. So the game of life that we described, and that hopefully you've looked up or you're watching the YouTube video, that has this, that satisfies this self-organizing complex system. Turns out that the game of life is Turing complete. If you know Alan Turing, if you've seen that movie, Imitation Game, he's probably the most important, one of the most important minds of the 20th century.
This is the first time I heard his name.
Yeah, Alan Turing, like Turing machine.
Shit.
He is the reason for us to have computers or theories of computation. I mean, there's many other people that, but he was like one of the central minds behind this, giving us our theory of computation, understanding how information, what information is and can be processed and used to compute things. We'll have an episode probably on computational theory and whatnot and Turing. But so the game of life is considered Turing complete. It is what that means is that it's a universal computer. Any code can be run on the game of life. So the game of life can run, in theory, it would be very impractical to do this, but in theory, the game of life can encode any computational state. And people have, for instance, on the game of life, they've got in the game of life to build up on the grid the game of life. So it's the game of life within the game of life.
Are you adding more rules to do this? How is that
No,
possible?
it's the same rule set. It's just that you define the initial state and then you hit run.
So it's able to do this because you define the initial states and then
Yeah.
hit
So
run and allow the same rules to unfold.
Yeah. So it's like how in Minecraft you can build a computer that can perform computation. And in theory, in Minecraft, you can create Minecraft within Minecraft on this computer.
So when we create the game Sims, it could be that we are already a simulation created, and then we're creating more simulations within the simulation.
Sure. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. So
the same shit applies.
Yeah. So this is just a fun bit. Like the complexity of the game of life is such that it's considered like a universal computer. It would be impractical to code up things in the game of life, but in theory it could be done.
Code up.
Like to run software in the game of life. Like to run PowerPoint in the game of life. Like maybe that'd be fun to like give PowerPoint slides using the game of life or something, but that would take probably a million years to figure out the initial state to give your slide deck. So
That's wild that those 4 simple rules that we mentioned earlier can create any of that.
Yeah.
So if this is a rule-based reality, there's got to be more than 4 rules. Obviously, we're much more complex than what the game of life simulations show.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe there's honestly not that many, and it's just the interacting of these. Let's say we have 20 rule sets.
Yeah.
Or 20 rules. And we're going to talk about later, too, how the rules can change of the game. Just like Jordan talked about how the chess rules could change from each person going once to each person going twice. But basically, I'm just trying to say our reality doesn't necessarily have to have millions and trillions of rules. It could just be very simple rule sets, and then you hit run on the program, and because of all the interactions of the cells and the critters within those cells, that's how we could get what we experience as our reality.
One thing
today.
we've skipped over so far is that we've defined all of our cellular automata in the game of life using on or off. So the cell can only be on or off. Our reality could be, and most likely is, if it's digital information, is not just on or off, but it's one of some number of states. So it's not like each cell can just be on or off, but each cell could be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or red, green, blue, orange, so on. So like there would, so again, you don't need many rules. You might have some amount of rules and some amount of possible cell states. And then if you hit run, that could... And another thing is that we've been working in 1- and 2-dimensional cellular automata. But if our world is a 3-dimensional cellular automata, or even higher dimensional, as we will get into, is that the potential for complexity is just like absurdly large. There's such a large space of possibilities of the system, and for instance our reality. So
Potentially infinite.
yeah, and actually we'll have a episode on Stephen Wolfram's theory of the Ruliad, where he's proposed that reality is not just one instance of a cellular automata with certain rules, but that all possible rules are existing all at once, and that's the whole universe. So our universe is just some subset of rules and states.
A sliver of reality.
It's a sliver of reality of this so-called Ruliad, but all possible rules exist simultaneously and are running, and you hit go, let all rules happen, boom, and then the universe pops out of that.
How do you feel about that personally? Do you think he's onto something there?
I like it. Lots of people don't.
It feels right to me.
Yeah, I think there's something there. Like, obviously work needs to be done with it, but there seems to be a lot of cool stuff going on with that. Lots of physicists don't like it, I think, but I think it's something that it's a cool endeavor at the very least. So
we'll do a whole episode on that. I love that.
Yeah, we will.
Okay, so another thing I was going to mention from the book is it talks about how in 1969, an inventor of the world's first programmable computer, Konrad Zuse, penned an unusual little book called Calculating Space. In this book, he argued that our universe could be described as a type of computer program that evolves through a series of discrete steps according to predefined rules. Zuse was proposing that, despite the astounding complexity of the natural world, at its foundation is a set of rather simple rules that compute and update the universe with each passing moment. The universe is computable and is, in fact, computing itself. In Zeus's model of the universe, at every point in time, the universe exists in a specific state which updates with each click of time. Every quantum number that we talked about at the beginning of every fundamental particle either remains the same or changes according to the rules that govern quantum processes. The universe updates with one massively parallel computation. This update process also says something important about time. Since the entire universe updates in parallel, changing from one state to the next, there is no in-between state of the universe, which means time itself is discrete. Time doesn't flow like a river, but it is simply the sequence of updates of the universe from its current state to the next, edging forward one click at a time. As computer scientist Tommaso Toffoli explains, in a sense, nature has been continually computing the next state of the universe for billions of years. All we have to do, and actually all we can do, is hitch a ride on this huge ongoing computation. Crazy.
Yep. So I will remind listeners that none of this is fact. None of this is currently mainstream physics ideology. This is a model that we're describing that could appear sufficient for many observations that we have, and what Gallimore's getting at in the book is that the model that he's developing in this book could sufficiently describe the crazy experiences we have on DMT, whereas it seems that current physics and neuroscience and evolutionary theory can't quite explain how a DMT world of hyperdimensional 5D objects and intelligent
5D and beyond, man.
5 and beyond
Nine-dimensional
dimensional spheres.
Realities is what I hear.
It doesn't seem like our brain could have evolved to a state to be able to comprehend that, and yet it reliably is accessible via 2 or 3 hits of DMT. So we'll get into that in more detail soon, but I just want to remind people that this is not fact. This is not, in many essences, is not empirically tested, but this is like it's a cool theoretical endeavor into a specific model of our reality that could explain certain phenomena that we experience. And it's, for me, it's really fun to think about. I just like to think about all sorts of possible reality models and whatnot. So again, you don't have to take all of this, and you shouldn't take all of this as fact, because it's really not. It's just it's one potential explanation for some observations that we make.
Good point.
Okay.
But also, what else could it be is my question. And another thing that we should all be asking ourselves is, given that humanity has evolved over thousands and millions of years to get to this point and to perceive reality in the way that we do, how could it possibly be that we're able to perceive other dimensions, like Jordan said? How? Like, actually, how are we able to access a completely different realm when we take a simple substance?
Yeah. So like, many will argue that it's like whatever delusions made up in the mind and stuff. And again, like you said,
they don't know until they experience different dimensions.
That's the thing.
Though. That's the thing.
You have to experience these states. And again, people, because you can't bring back your experience from DMT world and communicate it to people. Again, like, just people have to experience that to accept it. And I mean, even people that have taken DMT will argue that no, this is a delusion of our mind. Like, until somehow, I don't even know if science could get to this point. It might take a long time, but somehow you could prove one way or the other that this isn't gated information from higher dimensions or something. But I'm just saying, like, okay, I'm sort of like the devil on the shoulder. You're the angel on the shoulder. You're like, believe this theory. It's so cool. And I'm like, let's take a second here.
Take the scientific approach. We need both perspectives here.
Yeah, exactly. So that's all I want to. That's all I'm saying with it. It's that this isn't holy grail fact, but it sounds really cool. I would like if this was the universe we live in, but maybe it's not really.
Right. And I just want to clarify something else. I don't want people to believe anything. I never want you to take anything and just believe for the sake of believing. I think that's bullshit. I think that's old school spirituality or old school philosophy. What I do want people to do in life is to experience for themselves what the feeling is like, what the experience is like to do psychedelics, for example. Or if you don't want to ever do that, fine. But experience what things like transcendental meditation could be like if you actually want to get to potentially knowing other dimensions of reality. And if not, you'll never know. You have to experience in order to know. That's why we're here. That's why I believe we exist. We're here to experience so that we can know things. And if we just rely on belief, there's too many questions. There's too much information coming at us from all angles to really know what to believe and grasp onto. We need to trust our own judgment. We need to trust our own experience to form our proper perspectives of the world. So just because this is a podcast on spirituality and science and I'm supposed to bring the spiritual side of this, I don't want anyone to believe anything ever. Go out, grow a pair of balls, do some fucking psychedelics, or learn how to meditate over a long, gradual process. Both are going to lead you to other dimensions than we normally perceive. It's just how fast do you want to get there? That's all.
Yeah. Preach, Zach. Preach.
not preach.
Preach, King.
Fucking figure out your own philosophy. I'm not going to preach shit.
I have faith in you.
Do not believe in me.
I believe in you. Fuck you. Okay. What's the next topic?
Okay, moving on. How the brain is constantly creating worlds.
Okay.
Jordan is going to get us kicked off in this direction on page 62.
62.
Yes, sir.
What about 53? Was that in the notes?
You can read 53 if you like. Oh, shit. 53. Okay. This is page 53, I think, is still wrapping up Automata, right?
Yeah.
Okay, my bad. I skipped over that.
Okay, so we've talked about complex systems and complexity and how our universe could potentially be a complex system based off simple rules, updating from state to state, like the game of life. Or like these complex systems we described of the starlings flocking, or ants, but we didn't discuss that, but ants, things like that. So I just want to quickly discuss what like a definition of life could be. So we throw around what life is all the time. Like Zach looks alive right now, but the bookshelf behind him, I would say that's not alive.
So you think?
So I think, but life... Okay, so life can have some well-defined definition. um, Consciousness is a different thing. So I think life is sort of like a human construct, but then consciousness would be like more fundamental of like something is conscious or not, or all of nature is conscious, things like this. And there's varying levels of consciousness, like in panpsychism or something.
We'll get into all that
we'll
shit
get
in
into all
future
that shit.
episodes, but go on.
Okay, so I just want to discuss what like just life in general here. So we talked about the glider on the game of life. So that was it. So let me just read from the book here. So the glider, just to remind people, is that 5-cell pattern of information on the game of life that propagates and self-maintains itself. So Gallimore says, although a glider on a 2D cellular automata is certainly not alive, the glider maintains its identity despite its constituent cells changing every few time steps. Similarly, living organisms are not objects as such, but patterns of information that maintain and regenerate themselves over a period of time we recognize as a lifespan, which might be a few days or several decades. The simplest organism recognized as living is a single-celled organism, such as an amoeba. Although, throughout its short life, every single component of the amoeba might be degraded and replaced several times, it still maintains its identity as an amoeba. It achieves this by virtue of its construction, from complex networks of interacting components that maintain themselves despite individual components breaking down. As old components of networks degrade, other networks act to replace these components. So, the entire system regulates, maintains, and regenerates itself. Put simply, in the words of physicist Fritjof Capra, life is a factory that maintains itself from within. I think that's all I really wanted to say about this, and then we can move on. But did you have anything to throw in there?
Those three things that you said define life. What did you say? Regeneration? The entire system regulates, maintains, and regenerates itself.
Yeah.
Those are very, very good.
It's like a factory
indicators of yes, life, consciousness. Life, I guess. Life, not.
Yes. Let me go on to the next page. Let me go on to the next page. Let's see what he has to say about this. The process of self-maintenance, regulation, and regeneration is an emergent behavior, a highly complex type of information processing. This behavior emerges from the interactions of large numbers of simple components. So a living organism is not a large complex machine so much as a system of smaller and simpler machines, which are themselves patterns of information. It is the interaction of these small machines that produces the complex behavior of living organisms, and, fundamentally, these interactions are the flow of information through the system. You should be able to see the relationship between the emergent behavior of a flock of starlings or a colony of ants and a living cell, which one might go so far as to call a flock of molecules. In general, a living organism is a complex, hierarchically organized pattern of information that maintains, regenerates, and replicates itself over time. There we go. That tied it up nicely, I think so.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Okay.
Everything just seems to be a system within a system. So if we go down to the fundamental particles, subatomic particles, as soon as they start interacting with each other in a fairly ordered and chaotic, order and chaos balanced in a complex way, it immediately becomes a system, and that's the very foundational building blocks of life.
Yeah.
And up from there, it's just more systems and more systems and more systems interacting with one another. So, yeah, it's cool how this falls within what we were saying about cellular automata, where there is an entity that emerges, and then on top of that is an entity with more complexity and more and more and more complexity going all the way up.
So I have a divergence here, but I think it's interesting. Do you think... Okay, so let me define the term normative and how we use that. So normative might be... It's something that humans agree on, but it's not fundamental. It's like concepts that allow us to exchange and talk about something.
Do you have an example?
Yeah, here's an example. So what is a car? Like a car, we would say, is the metal that that surrounds the shape of a car, like the metal that contains the wheels, and it contains the seats and the engine and whatnot. But a car on its own doesn't function. What you need is a road. The car needs a road to push off of and move. If you have a frictionless surface, the car is useless. So is a car the metal plus the road? But okay, wait, if gravity doesn't exist, the car can't be pulled down towards the road to be driven on. So is the car like the metal plus the road plus the Earth's gravitational field? So the car in itself is not a fundamental thing. It is a concept that we've drawn a boundary around some atoms and said that's the car. That's the normative concept of a car that allows us to talk about the car.
Can I challenge you a bit on that?
Yeah, sure.
If the car's in space, like fucking Fast and Furious these days,
Mm-hmm.
if it's in space, it's still a car to me. It doesn't need the
But
road.
there's no fundamental car in nature. Like the car is an object. It's an abstraction that we've drawn a boundary around a set of atoms and called that a car because it's convenient for us to call it a car.
So are you saying, okay, I want to try and make sense of this. So dismantled in all separate pieces, we don't call it a car anymore. We call it windshield. We call it muffler. We call
Right,
it...
and each of those is normatively defined as
Right.
so that the windshield is not fundamentally a windshield. It's a collection of atoms.
So are you getting at these things that are normative to us are essentially just higher emergent
yeah, it's
critters on a grid?
Exactly. It's just where we've drawn the line around the grid. So what I'm getting at is that I don't know if life is a fundamental thing. It is just a pattern of information that we've drawn a boundary around
And said, hey,
and
that's
said,
life.
That is life. Like this is life. But really, like I could draw many boundaries within your body and look at each cell and draw a boundary around that and be like, that's life. I could look at the system that is your gastrointestinal tract and be like, oh, that's a complex system that behaves very sophisticatedly. It's solving complex problems. That's life. But you are, as an aggregate, you're the life form of all these hierarchically organized subsystems and then each of those are hierarchically, it's all nested. There's subcomponents nesting all this. What I'm asking here is, or I think this might be the case, is that life is just a human construct that just conveniently allows us to draw the boundary around certain complex systems on our scale and talk about them. But life, again, as he defined it, a living organism, a complex, hierarchically organized pattern of information that maintains, regenerates, and replicates itself over time. That's not just like a human. Like there's so many of these components that could satisfy that definition.
Well, because, for example, AI could get to that point where it maintains itself, it regenerates itself, and it replicates itself.
Yeah, exactly. So to me, life is not some like fundamental idea, or it's not some fundamental part of nature, but it's just where we've drawn the boundary around certain
for
systems.
sake of convenience for us to refer to.
Yeah, and here's where it's interesting, is that consciousness is perhaps the only thing that appears to be non-normative, is that a conscious experience is not defined by setting a boundary around something. The conscious experience is what it is in itself. Like there's no arbitrariness, there's no arbitrary border to me having this conscious experience and these conscious states. So Bernardo Kastrup talks about this. I've literally just stolen this argument from him, or this thought process from him, where he's discussing the difference between normative and non-normative. And it seems like consciousness is, I don't know if it's the only, I think it's the only truly non-normative thing, is that we could agree that the experience you're having it just is what it is. It's not
Normative.
Yeah. But again,
labeled.
It's not labeled. It's not, yeah, it's you're having the experience. Okay, Jordan from the future here. I just want to add a better example to explain what I'm saying here. So our body could be said to not be arbitrarily defined as a boundary because, for instance, if a bullet flies by me, I won't feel that in my conscious experience as pain. But if a bullet hits me, I'll definitely feel that as pain. Another example would be if light from an object enters my eye in the process that Zach described earlier, I would perceive vision, but if the light does not enter my eye, I will not perceive anything. So these are not arbitrary definitions of my boundaries. The conscious experience happened because my boundary was ontologically relevant, one might say. So hopefully that clears this up a bit more. And back to the episode. But it's not. There's no arbitrary boundary defining your experience. Like, I can't just draw a boundary around the two of us and there's an experience that the shared system of both of us is having. No, it seems like each of us is having our own unique experience.
And that seems to be the most fundamental thing then.
Yeah.
That's a good point. I would have to think about that for hours.
Yeah,
Feels
this
like
is
to give a
getting off
proper
track, but I
response to that, but
I
that's
just wanted
sick.
to bring that up because life, we're so used to like thinking of life and non-living and living, but these are just human constructs. These are just boundaries that we've drawn around certain
Well, because even
systems.
when we define life as regulating, maintaining, and regenerating itself, those are all human constructs.
Mhm.
Those are labels we smacked on life. So
At the end of the day,
it
if-
defines it well, like from a human perspective, to say this is living, this is not living, because this regulates, maintains, and regenerates itself. But
exactly. At the end of the
but
day,
at the end of the
it's
day,
all the
it's
grid.
a
It's all
human label.
information on the grid. If this model of reality is right, like there's just cells on the grid. Where consciousness comes in is another debate or question we could ask for this thing. But let's move on. I think this is too long-winded, but
it's good though. It's good.
yeah. I just wanted to bring that up.
Keeps us thinking.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we're going to move on to how the brain is constantly creating worlds. And now you'll get to page 62.
Okay. Wait, am I reading 62 and 63 or I forget?
Do
where
as much as you want. I just have 62 written down, but whatever you feel is necessary.
Okay. Okay, so let me just read directly from 62. Your brain is the most complex structure in the known universe, effortlessly manifesting the rich and lucent tapestry of your world from moment to moment. As you witness this glorious unfolding of the world from behind your eyes, you'd be forgiven for losing sight of its fundamental nature as information generated by your brain, which is itself an information complex instantiated on the grid. Each of us lives out each of our lives from behind our eyes in a world that French philosopher Pierre Teilhard de Chardin
Nailed it.
called the within of things. Quote, the object of a direct intuition and the substance of all knowledge. Unquote. It's not enough to say that your body and brain is built from information. For conscious beings such as ourselves, borrowing from philosopher Thomas Nagel, there is something it's like to be this particular configuration of information. There is a within. And this within is your phenomenal world, the world of subjective experience, and the only world you can ever know. Whether you are hurrying down a damp street on a gray Sunday morning, or dancing with ancient gods in a jeweled temple with bizarre crystalline geometries of immeasurable luminosity and form, it is always your own personal world. And it is always built from information generated by your brain. If we are to understand the bizarre worlds visited at the peak of a DMT trip, we must first understand the more prosaic world of your daily life in this universe. Its purpose, why it takes the form it does, and its relationship to everything happening out there in the so-called external world. Transcendental idealist Immanuel Kant distinguished between the phenomenon, which is the subjective world within each of us lives, and the noumenon, the unknowable world in itself, independent of our perceptions. Your brain is a high-level information complex that generates the information that is your phenomenal world. This is the phenomenon. The noumenon is all the information being generated by the grid. The world in itself is information. Your brain generates a highly complex form of information that has the special property of subjectivity, You experience this information as your world, whether you are awake, dreaming, or at the peak of a DMT trip. Okay.
Beautiful. Nothing from 63?
You carry on and I'll take a look, but I think that's a good enough start to this.
Okay, very good. To build off that, I was going to jump up to page 67. In summary, your normal waking phenomenal world is a model of the world that your brain has evolved to facilitate your survival as a complex pattern of information on the grid. Your brain, just like the rest of you, is a highly complex, hierarchically organized structure, like all things, built from information, although it sits at the apex of the known hierarchy of complexity. Although all structures generate, process, and are built from information, a brain is special in that it generates information that manifests as your phenomenal inner world, your personal reality. Whether you are awake, dreaming, or tumbling through the elfin playgrounds after 2 lungfuls of thick DMT vapor, your personal reality is always built from information generated by your brain. Although these worlds might be very different in structure and in terms of their relationship to the environment, they are unified by their fundamental nature, information. All right. So, the brain has developed, over the course of evolution, a world model in our head of what our external reality looks like. The external data in our reality enters our brain via the senses and sends electric impulses through our central nervous system to our brain, where certain neurons in the cortex, in what is called the cortical column of neurons, are a match to the information coming in, and which are connected to a variety of other simultaneously stimulated cortical columns. Each of these columns sends a signal to the thalamus in the brain, which immediately relays that information back to the cortical column, creating a thalamocortical loop. These loops combine to form a thalamocortical state, which we experience as our state of being, the combination of our feelings, thoughts, and senses, forming a very specific state, comprised of the intrinsic information that our brain generated and that the extrinsic information that stimulated that inner information. In other words, our brain's hardware and software are triggered in a specific way due to an external stimulus, creating a state of being that we experience. This is happening all day, every day, even in dreams and drug trips, because the brain continues to do this even in the absence of external stimuli.
Yeah, so it's the intrinsic information in your brain. So these thalamocortical columns, is that the precise term that you used?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's millions of those columns in your brain, and depending on which ones are currently activated and in synchrony with one another, that's what dictates what your brain is perceiving moment to moment.
Yeah.
And external sensory information can modulate that and tell your brain what state to be occupying. Like, I'm looking at you because light, and I'm seeing you because light is telling my brain which states to build up. But I'm not seeing you as you really are. This is the noumenon of Kant, the world in itself. I'm seeing the phenomenon of you as generated by my brain. I'm seeing my brain's model of you. The you I see is not out there in the world. The you I see, that sounds funny to say because that's just 3 letters. The Zach that I see out there is not out there. He is inside of my skull. You are the Zach with colors and shape and the smile and cute little glasses.
Fuck you. They're badass glasses.
Yeah, badass glasses. They're very cool glasses. Yeah. That's not a distance away from me. There is something out there that is supposedly you, that is out there at some distance away from me. But as I'm seeing it in these colors and shapes, that is all inside of my brain. I only have access to these intrinsic states, these thalamocortical columns and states that generate my world. Again, external information is telling my brain which states to currently activate. And by activating those, it produces an image of Zach in my skull. But that is not the Zach that is out there. Potentially, you're some high-dimensional being that is in 10 dimensions right now, but I'm perceiving some 3-dimensional aspect of it. Like this is where idealism gets really interesting, is like, what is the world in itself? It could be something completely different than what we're perceiving. But
essentially what we're perceiving is a sliver of reality of what could be a much larger picture that we cannot see because we're only operating within the third dimension. Yeah,
I mean, even with current physical theory, like there's no such thing as objects out there, as continuous objects. Like, it's all quantum fields with certain states and
data structures
and data structures, quantum information. But my brain doesn't have access to all those states. It has to model states based on its billions of neurons and trillions of synapses. And that model is what I perceive as my world.
That's right. So before you continue, we're going to say the same thing over and over again in different ways so that hopefully one of these explanations lands for you guys. I'm going to say another one, but go on.
This is, I just, the one that sticks with me is the ceiling above my head and the floor beneath my feet are contained within my skull. The ceiling that I see, it's white. The floor I see and feel on my feet. Some carpet texture. All of that is being produced by my brain. So it's necessarily, all of that looks like it's out there is inside of my skull right now. That's the one that sticks with me. That blows my mind, like, when I just really think about that.
It's like your mind is a radio and it's picking up on the signals that the ceiling and the floor are transmitting into your brain. And if you didn't have that signal, you wouldn't perceive anything.
Yeah. Or I'd perceive the state that, it'd be like dreaming, I'd perceive the states that are going on intrinsically. But yeah. That's
very good. I feel like I kind of fudged it up, what you were trying to say there a bit. But how I see it is, just in different words, everything is data structures, everything around us, every person, every place, everything. It's all data structures interacting with each other. And our brain perceives these data structures in the way that it does because that's how we evolved over evolution for our survival. There's a lot of information out there that our brain scraps. It totally pushes it all aside because that information is not necessary for us to survive, so we didn't develop the ability to perceive it.
Yeah, I can't see all the trillions of particles in this room, like all the air particles and their speeds, and track all of that. Like, my brain would literally dissolve into a hot soup.
That's right.
As Bernardo likes to say. It's your brain builds a model. It does not map out reality as reality is.
Right. So Jordan has a data structure right now. He's comprised of cells, but my eyes don't require to see Jordan's cells for my survival. All I need to see is his face and his fist, and potentially if he's going to swing at me and punch me, or if he's going to offer me some food to eat.
Yeah, this is why eyewitness testimony is so fallible, because you're not tracking every detail of reality. You have to store memories that are themselves imperfect, and you have to gather the relevant information of your surroundings and compress a lot of that information down to simple structures that your brain can comprehend. So you're not going to remember all the details of every scene that you observe. Your brain is a very optimized, efficient engine to more or less help us survive. Anyways, that's good.
So just a few more points on this. So external information, everything we see around us or hear or taste or touch, we can call it external sensory data or extrinsic sensory input. So these are data structures without detail. This data needs to be interpreted by another system into something comprehensible. That other system is our brain. So the intrinsic data of our brain molds extrinsic data into something understandable and useful for survival. The ensemble of thalamocortical columns, so thalamocortical meaning neurons within the cortex and sending electrical impulses to the thalamus of the brain and creating, so two sections of the brain, cortex and thalamus, interacting together. That's what I mean when I say thalamocortical. So the ensemble of thalamocortical columns being stimulated simultaneously literally forms your inner world. These exact neurons firing together creates your state, the combined experience of your feelings, thoughts, and sensory information.
Cool. I'm going to read from the book, which is basically what you're saying, but I'm just going to go...
76?
Yeah, I got it.
Beauty.
Okay, so quickly just to define a term so that we can get to the next page. So in the human brain, functional segregation refers to the way specific areas of the cortex or brain and specific sets of neurons within those areas are responsible for receiving, generating, and processing specific types of information. So in other words, I'm not reading from the book now. In other words, there's information like the shape of Zach's head is like roughly spherical. So I have a functionally segregated region of my brain. So segregation means like different from others. So it's a unique part of my brain that would process a certain function. In this case, it's the function of distinguishing spheres from other shapes. So a set of neurons at the back of my brain, because that's where our brain processes visual information, a set of neurons will activate or respond to sensory data that looks like a sphere or like a circular object, and they'll fire and tell the rest of my brain complex that there's a circle at this like coordinate in my field of view. And right now it's nodding in agreement. Oh, it's shaking its head now. He's angry. He's laughing. So there's functionally segregated bits of my brain that are responding and sensitive to all of these features of my external reality. I have some that are sensitive to movement in the up and down direction when you nodded. I have some that are sensitive to movement left and right when you're shaking your head. Our brain has many functionally segregated subcomponents that can respond to external information, encode it, and then build our phenomenal world. So let me get back to reading. So the smallest functionally segregated area of the cortex is known as a cortical column, a cylindrical structure containing about 100 neurons, and the cortex can be described as a mosaic of columns packed side by side. At any point in time, the entire cortex displays a complex pattern of activation of these columns. This pattern of activation is a specific state of the cortex selected from a practically infinite number of possible states and encodes all the information that constitutes your entire phenomenal world at that moment. So he says, we define information as being generated when a system selects between a finite number of discrete states. This is exactly how the brain generates information, albeit using a system with a vast number of states. Whenever the cortical column mosaic selects a specific state or pattern of activation, it generates an enormous amount of information by ruling out countless other states. So this goes back to the chessboard. By picking one cell of that chessboard, I ruled out 63 other cells. For my brain, by picking out one arrangement of active states, it's ruled out all other active states. So the information generated is absolutely ginormous. Like there's billions and trillions, so billions of neurons with like trillions of connections, and all the combinatorics of connection between each of those components is some number that you cannot fathom. It's absolutely bigger than our universe in terms of combinatorics.
Crazy.
So
essentially infinite.
Essentially infinite, yeah. It's like how I sent you that video on how 52 factorial is not comprehensible. So 52 factorial is, if you have a deck of cards, that's the number of unique ways you can arrange the cards in a deck of cards. That's why, more or less, card games are random, unless like you're counting cards. But card games are basically random because to have a specific sequence of cards is 52 factorial. If you look up how big that number is, it's like that number is larger than the number of atoms in the universe, and it's by a lot.
Wow.
So it's like just in a deck of cards, 52 cards. You can hold that in your palm. But the number of arrangements of that is combinatorially explosive, we say. You cannot fathom even close to that. And that's just 52 cards. 52.
Measly,
in our brain,
measly,
we have
man.
billions.
Seems like it should be measly.
Billions of neurons and trillions of connections. And to select one state of that, which is equivalent to selecting one arrangement of the deck of cards, is unfathomable how large that combinatorial space is.
It's crazy that we even try and label emotions then and be like, oh, happy, sad, content, angry, when there's so many possible combinations of neurons that can be firing. It's
that
like,
is
how
an
the
interesting
fuck do you
point.
even specify what emotion you're feeling?
That is interesting.
Especially if you're a woman.
That's women are. I don't understand women. I'll never understand women. But
they have 8 times the connections between the lobes than men. So
is that right?
That's why they have troubles shutting off thoughts. That's why they have troubles letting go of things. And their emotions are very connected.
We have to source this. I want to look into that. That sounds interesting, but I haven't heard of that.
That's interesting.
Before.
That's essentially all I know. But
okay.
we'll do more research and talk about it.
Don't take that as fact. As Zach said, never believe a word Zach fucking says. He's a liar.
Experience it for yourself.
Anyways, we're not going to linger on that too much, but I hope this is building up some intuition for what our brain is potentially doing.
I want to just point out too quickly the 1D cellular automata that we talked about, where the center cell is impacted by its 2 immediate neighbors horizontally, only its left and its right cell.
Mm-hmm.
Just those 3 cells together have 256 possible combinations. So that's 3 tiny cells. Imagine billions and trillions of neurons with billions and trillions of potential combinations in our own brain. So it's no wonder that we're able to plug into a different combination in order to perceive different realms that are out there.
Mm-hmm.
Come on.
Okay, I'm going to read, continuing on. Okay, so patterns of activation of these individual columns encode all the information in your phenomenal world. However, the second fundamental characteristic of your world, after information, is unification. Your world is always unified. If you look at a bowl of brightly colored fruits, it's impossible to become confused as to which color is attached to which fruit. This seems entirely obvious, and yet, based on how we understand the brain to function, it's actually quite a feat. The color information of the fruits is processed at an entirely separate area of the cortex from their shape, and yet the correct color is always bound to its particular fruit. This is known as the binding problem. Since there is no superordinate area of the cortex, like a projection screen, where all of the features of an object are brought together to form the unified structure, the various features of each object remain as a distributed pattern of information across the cortical columns. Continuing to read from the next page. The solution to this binding problem lies in the massively interconnected nature of the cortical columns. Rather than a mosaic of independent columns, the columns have dense connections formed from large numbers of synapses that allow rapid two-way interactions. So, a pattern of activation of columns can be integrated to form a unified structure. The thalamus, a walnut-sized structure sitting at the center of the brain, is commonly seen as a relay station through which all sensory information, barring that from the nose, must pass on its way to the cortex. But this is only part of the story. Each functionally segregated area of the cortex, each cortical column, is reciprocally connected to a corresponding region of the thalamus, forming a thalamocortical loop. In fact, the thalamus can be described as a miniature map or 7th layer of the cortex. So, each cortical column is better described as a thalamocortical column. When a thalamocortical column is activated, the electrochemical activity that can be recorded on an EEG, so that's like those probes that you could attach to people's head to read their brain waves. Let me just back up a bit. When a thalamocortical column is activated, the electrochemical activity can be recorded on an EEG as an electrical oscillation at around 40 hertz, known as a gamma oscillation. This particular type of oscillation is important for the integration of he calls them T columns, so thalamocortical columns, T columns, just to make it a bit easier. This particular type of oscillation, the gamma oscillation, is important for the integration of T columns across the cortex. When you observe an object, such as a strawberry for example, the T columns that encode its various features, its red color, its shiny mottled texture, its characteristic shape, are activated and form an activation pattern. The electrochemical activity of each activated T column begins oscillating in the gamma range, and these oscillations rapidly become synchronized. This can be compared to the way a wine glass can be made to sing or even shatter if the right frequency of sound, the natural frequency of the glass, is played. Gamma oscillations can be thought of as the natural frequency of an activated T column, and when many T columns are simultaneously activated, they rapidly synchronize their oscillations and transiently self-organize to form a unified structure, a thalamocortical state. The activity of a large number of T columns can be integrated within a few hundred milliseconds to generate the information-rich and unified T state that encodes your phenomenal world. At every moment of your life, your entire world is a unique pattern of activation of a huge number of T columns distributed across the cortex and unified by the thalamocortical system. Your world changes from moment to moment as a sequence of these T states, one T state flowing into the next. Since the number of possible T states is vast, when the cortex selects a specific T state, it generates an immense amount of information. There's a lot more to read, but I think we can leave it there for now.
I can read the rest. I can read the rest here.
So do you have in your notes that we wanted to read through this?
Well, page 84, yeah.
Yeah.
So I'll just finish this paragraph here.
Okay.
Since all of the information that constitutes your phenomenal world is encoded by these T states by the activity of a thalamocortical system, it's natural to wonder what exactly is the role of sensory information from the external world. The construction of a phenomenal world is something the brain does by default and can be fully independent of incoming sensory information. During dreaming, for example, the brain is perfectly capable of building a phenomenal world with all senses apparently intact, despite having almost no access to sensory information. To explain this, we'll first distinguish between two types of information that the brain uses to build your world. The world is itself built from the information generated by the activity of the T columns that form a unified T state. We'll call this intrinsic information, and we'll refer to the information from outside the brain through the senses as extrinsic information. When extrinsic information enters the brain from the retina or the inner ear, for example, it is not simply added to the intrinsic information. Whether or not there is any incoming sensory information, neurons fire spontaneously and T columns are activated, generating intrinsic information by forming T states. Rather than adding to this intrinsic information, extrinsic information from the senses amplifies or awakens specific patterns of intrinsic information. Specific patterns of extrinsic information are matched to specific patterns of intrinsic information being generated by the thalamocortical system. Or, equivalently, the thalamocortical system can only absorb information that matches the intrinsic information it generates. For example, when you look up into a clear blue sky, the blue light activates the blue cone cells in the retina, and this extrinsic information is transmitted to the visual cortex as a sequence of action potentials. This pattern of information is matched to the activity of a particular set of neurons in the visual cortex, those tuned to this particular type of information, the blue sky, and amplifies their activity. The effect is to increase the amount of intrinsic information in the thalamocortical state that is experienced as the color blue. Note that the extrinsic information itself never enters the T state. It can only modulate or stimulate the intrinsic information being generated by the natural activity of the thalamocortical system. The thalamocortical system has a repertoire of T states, patterns of active T columns that it tends to adopt. This repertoire is only a subset of the practically infinite number of possible states. extrinsic information is matched to and so selects specific T states from this repertoire, but never adds to or replaces this ongoing intrinsic information. The brain is not a video camera, like Jordan said earlier, capturing moving images of the world and presenting them to our consciousness. Sensory information only modulates the ongoing activity of the thalamocortical system, and your phenomenal world is built entirely from intrinsic information. When you descend into sleep at night, access to almost all extrinsic sensory information is removed, and yet the brain continues to build complete phenomenal worlds as you dream. These dream worlds usually appear strikingly similar to the waking consensus world. In fact, the only difference between the waking world and the dream world in terms of their construction is that the waking world is modulated by extrinsic sensory information, whereas the dream world is not. Without access to sensory information, the thalamocortical system, using T states from its repertoire, will construct the consensus world as a default. Sensory information constrains the construction of your phenomenal world by selecting specific T states from the repertoire, but the world is not built from sensory information. Whether you are awake, dreaming, or deep in DMT worlds, your world is always built from intrinsic information. So I know we've said all this a few times now, but hopefully by now it's starting to get cemented in your brain. Hopefully one of these explanations has landed for you and you're able to retain it. I want to talk about the connectivity of the brain and how there's 3 different types, and information flow goes through each of these methods of connectivity. So first off, we have structural connectivity of neurons. Neurons are the cells of the brain. Structural connectivity means physical connectivity, so neurons being physically connected to each other.
You can think of it as like wires connecting, like neuron to neuron, and like they're like physically, they're not ever attached, they're just like close to each other. Like a synapse is like there's like a space between neurons.
Right, technically there is a space, but yeah, that's
but like
where the neurotransmitter crosses. So the chemical goes from one neuron out of its axon, which is the tentacle exporting information, and then the next neuron has a tentacle reaching out.
It's called dendrites.
A dendrite to receive that information into that neuron.
Into the receptors on the surface. Yeah.
So that's what the structure of the brain is. That's the structural connectivity.
Billions or a trillion of these. I think billions is probably like more correct. Of billions of neurons.
I have no idea.
And then there's trillions of these like dendritic synapses that connect the neurons.
Yeah.
So that's the structural connectivity.
Yes.
And what's interesting, I'll just add, is that is malleable, or what we call plastic. Like your brain can change those connections, and that's what allows you to form new memories or learn new skills. So our brain is adaptable. It can change in good or bad ways. Like you can form traumas, you can form good memories or good skills. Like that's what makes our brain so adaptive to our environment, is that it can mold and change itself. It can change its structural connectivity.
Yeah, and repetition builds those connections or strengthens them, and inactivity or not using them makes you lose them.
Yep.
The other type of connectivity is effective connectivity, which is when those thalamocortical columns that we were talking about are simultaneously stimulated with one another. So even if certain neurons aren't structurally connected through these axons and dendrites that we mentioned, but they are firing at the same time as a thalamocortical column on the other side of the brain, that would be classified as effective connectivity because they're both being affected at the same time.
Yeah, it's like cause and effect. It's like, so this firing over here can affect other neurons elsewhere in the brain and cause and effect in them. So that's effectively, they're affecting each other. They're causing co-excitation of one another and synchronization and
so let's say I have a thalamocortical column that fires when I look at Jordan's face, and then that immediately connects to another thalamocortical column where it makes me mad and I want to punch it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
like I always am when I look at Jordan's face. That's effective connectivity. Functional connectivity would be when all of these thalamocortical columns that are stimulated at the same time through effective connectivity. So the collective of all of those thalamocortical columns is called functional connectivity. So functional connectivity can also be called a thalamocortical state, or like the state that we feel that we're in.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully that makes sense. I don't know how else to say that.
Yeah. Yeah, so I can kind of elaborate a bit. Actually, yeah, with MRI scanners, you can do you can basically take images of the brain and determine the structural connectivity. So this is done using diffusion tensor imaging, DTI. We'll have Eric on the podcast, who I work with, and because he does DTI, he can talk about that.
Homie of the show.
Homie of the show.
You don't just work with him; he's a homie of the show.
Exactly.
And a homie
yeah.
of Jordan.
Well, I meant I said work because he works on the DTI, but yes, yeah.
You mean more than that to us, Eric.
You mean more? I love you, Eric. Okay, so Eric will talk about this in more detail, but you can determine like a map of these connections throughout the brain and see what regions and how strong these connections are from region to region in the brain and whatnot. Functional connectivity we can also get a sense of with fMRI. So what we do with fMRI is we observe basically like the whole brain, and we see which regions are firing at the same time. So we can image in real time regions that are firing in sync with one another and others that are out of sync with one another. But the regions that are in sync with one another, we say they're functionally connected because they're performing the same activation in time, even though they're potentially on opposite sides of the brain. So what you do is you measure a signal of blood oxygen in each region. So the blood oxygen is related to how much firing is going on in that region. And you get a time series at one region in the brain. And if that time series looks like another region in the brain, then you compute a correlation coefficient between those. And that tells you how functionally connected those two regions are. So now you can start to build a map of functionally connected regions of the brain that are all co-activating with one another and forming so-called states, or like the T states that you describe. And it turns out that there's many regular networks that come out of this. So you've maybe heard of the default mode network. So if you're just laying still, not doing anything, and your mind's wandering, the default mode network comes out in these functional MRI images as firing. So those regions of your brain start to fire. So there's 3 regions towards the back of your brain. It's like 1, 2, 3. And then 1 region at the front of your brain. And those are all talking to each other, communicating. And this is the state that you go in when you mind wander or when you introspect and not really engage in activity. There's a bunch of other networks, like there's a motor network that when I start to engage in tasks, there's regions on the side of my brain, kind of like above my ears, that coordinate motor activity, and those start to talk to each other. And the rest of my networks sort of quiet down and become less connected to each other while the motor networks are talking to each other. So you can start to map this out with functional MRI. Effective connectivity is actually the hardest one to image because that asks a different question. Functional connectivity is quite a simple question. It's like, are these 2 regions active at the same time? That's just like yes or no. Effective connectivity is asking, does region A cause region B to fire? Or does region B cause region A to fire? That's a harder question to answer. You have to do some dynamic modeling of the brain, for instance, or use some mathematical models. It gets quite complicated and difficult to do. But those 3 connectivity states can essentially be imaged using an MRI scanner, which is pretty cool. And that's what we do in our lab. And many other labs do this too.
All right. Moving on to how DMT affects the brain. So Jordan is going to start off on page 102 and explain action potentials and receptors.
Okay. So let's talk. So we've talked about neurons and we've talked about the structural connectivity. So we said that neurons are sort of connected to each other, and the connection is what we call the synapse. So what happens for one neuron to talk to another neuron is that the firing neuron wants to communicate with the neuron that it's connected to, and to do that, it releases neurotransmitters across the synapse. So the synapse is just a space, an empty space between neuron A and neuron B. Neuron A releases some neurotransmitters, which are things like dopamine, serotonin, glutamate, acetylcholine, other molecules. These are just molecules. And that molecule is picked up. So on the surface of neuron B, there are receptors for specific molecules. For instance, there's dopamine neurons, and they're called dopamine neurons because neuron A releases dopamine, neuron B has receptors that dopamine can bind to and communicate, hey, neuron A just fired, like you might want to do something in neuron B. So that's, but if, for instance, serotonin was released somehow, like by neuron A, but neuron B doesn't have serotonin receptors, that serotonin's not going to do anything. So you need the molecule, the communicating neurotransmitter at the firing neuron, and then you need the receptor at the receiving neuron for there to be information flow between neurons. So neuron B, the receiving neuron, doesn't just fire once it receives one dopamine molecule from the firing neuron. What happens is that it integrates signal from many bound dopamine molecules in its receptors, and this raises what's called the potential or the voltage of neuron B. So neuron B is at rest with nothing going on. Neuron B's in what's called a hyperpolarized state, where it's a negative voltage which keeps it from firing, so it won't fire on its own. But if you start binding dopamine molecules to these synapses at these receptor sites, that triggers signaling cascades within the neuron that raise this resting polarization. So this is called depolarization, when the potential is raised. And every neuron has a threshold that once its potential is raised over, so once enough dopamine or neurotransmitter has bound to this neuron, it reaches a high enough potential that causes it to fire. So I'll just read from the book here. So one of the most common effects of a receptor is to alter the membrane potential of the neuron. If the membrane potential is raised closer to the threshold potential, known as depolarization, then the neuron is more likely to fire an action potential, since the sum of excitatory potentials resulting from presynaptic activity is more likely to push the membrane potential over the firing threshold. This is also called excitation, often described as making the neuron more excitable. Some receptors have the opposite effect, lowering the membrane potential, known as hyperpolarization, and pushing it further away from the firing threshold. This makes the neuron less likely to fire or less excitable. Since the effect of a neuromodulator is determined entirely by the receptors to which it binds, the same neuromodulator might have very different effects on different neurons. And since neurons usually contain many different types of receptor, it can be difficult to predict the overall effect of a neuromodulator on any particular type of neuron. So in summary, there's many neuromodulators or neurotransmitters like I mentioned, dopamine, serotonin. There's many different types of receptors, and the effect of the receptor can either be to raise the neuron's excitability or to lower its excitability, to inhibit it from firing. So you get this complex interplay. It's almost like these complex game of life systems where you get cool levels of rules that are in balance that can finely tune these systems to exhibit complex behavior. So I'm going to give an example of serotonin where, let's see where I want to start exactly. Okay, let's start here, I think. So this is from the book. There are 7 recognized classes of serotonin, or 5-HT receptors, 5-HT1 to 5-HT7, with some of these classes also containing subtypes. For example, the 5-HT2 receptor class contains 3 receptor subtypes, 5-HT2A, B, and C, each with its own particular effects. The most important site of action of the classic psychedelics is the 5-HT2A receptor, and the potency of a psychedelic drug correlates quite closely with how strongly it binds to this particular receptor subtype, and blocking this receptor abolishes any psychedelic effects. So serotonin, remember 5-HT is serotonin. Serotonin binding to the 5-HT receptor has a depolarizing effect. The membrane potential is nudged towards the threshold, in other words, makes it more likely to fire. But serotonin also binds to 5-HT1A receptors, also found on these serotonin neurons. But this has the opposite hyperpolarizing effect on the neuron. Activating this receptor pulls the membrane potential further from the threshold, making it less likely that the neuron will fire. Since these two different receptors share space on the same neuronal membrane, they have an antagonizing effect on each other, with the 5-HT2A receptor exciting the pyramidal cell and the 5-HT1A receptor inhibiting it. As such, the balance of 5-HT2A versus 5-HT1A activation sets the excitability of the pyramidal cell and, by extension, the entire cortex. So, goes on. As well as their antagonizing effect on neuron excitability, the 5-HT2A and 5-HT1A receptors also have opposing effects on gamma oscillations, which are important for integrating the pattern of T-column activation to form a unified T-state. Activation of the 5-HT2A receptor promotes gamma oscillations. Remember, gamma oscillations allow synchronization between states.
Especially 40 hertz.
Yeah, so gamma is around 40 hertz. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Whereas 5-HT1A receptors inhibit these oscillations. Under normal circumstances, it is serotonin that occupies and activates both receptor subtypes, tuning the excitability of the cortical pyramidal cells and setting the balance of cortical activation. The significance of this balance can be appreciated when it is disrupted. The classic psychedelics bind selectively to the 5-HT2A receptor, but have little activity at the 5-HT1 receptor subtype. This tips the balance in favor of depolarization, exciting the cortex and promoting gamma oscillations in the thalamocortical loops. This has 2 effects. Firstly, the cortex becomes more sensitive to incoming sensory information. The spikes that reach the cortex via the thalamus are likely to activate a larger number of T columns than they would in the absence of the drug. The reason for this is straightforward. Whether or not a pyramidal cell, and by extension a T column, is activated depends entirely on whether the excitatory postsynaptic potentials it receives push its membrane potential over the firing threshold. When sensory information in the form of action potentials reaches the cortex, large areas of the cortex and so large numbers of T columns will receive this information. However, most of these columns will not be activated, since these excitatory potentials will fail to push the membrane potential of the pyramidal cells over the threshold. By binding selectively to 5-HT2A receptors, psychedelic drugs set the basal membrane potential, or the potential in the absence of stimulation, of all the pyramidal cells slightly higher. This means that more of these cells will be nudged over the threshold as the sensory information reaches the cortex. Furthermore, once these T columns are activated, they are more likely to successfully transmit their information to other T columns, since they will also be more excitable. The overall effect is that sensory information is not only better absorbed by the primary sensory areas of the cortex, but is also more likely to spread to other areas of the cortex. The architecture of thalamocortical connectivity usually controls the spread of information between columns, but this control begins to slip as the T columns become increasingly excitable and more readily activated by even relatively weak connections. Secondly, the enhancement of gamma oscillations by psychedelics means that activated T columns are more likely to be incorporated into an integrated T state, which contains all the information that constitutes a phenomenal world. Furthermore, since this enhanced gamma effect is widespread across the cortex, highly coherent gamma oscillations are likely to spread more freely, potentially even in the absence of incoming sensory information. T columns are recruited into novel activation patterns that aren't part of the normal repertoire of T states. The T state repertoire expands to include entirely new states. Normally, the intrinsic activity of the thalamocortical system provides the context for incoming sensory information, which is matched to this ongoing activity, selecting and amplifying states from the T state repertoire. However, in the presence of a psychedelic drug, the inflated state repertoire means that sensory information may select completely novel T states. I'll stop there for now. That's been a lot of reading, but to summarize, basically, in the case of classic psychedelics, they raise excitability of your neurons, making them more likely to fire, and they promote these gamma oscillations, which recruit novel T states or novel phenomenal worlds that you would not be able to construct in normal ordinary circumstances. So it basically expands your potential experiences beyond what you could do under sober conditions.
Right. New neurons that aren't normally stimulated become stimulated.
No, more specifically, new patterns of neuron activation are stimulated. So
the same neurons that have been firing in a different combination are firing in a new combination.
So it's the pattern specifically that is different. The neurons themselves can be part of many different patterns.
The action potential thing is interesting because this is how all of our impulses work. When enough neurons fire and cross into an action potential, we receive an impulse or an impulsive thought to have a snack or have a drink of water. And where, like, the first thing I thought of when I was reading this action potential thing is how addictions can be formed from repeated action potentials fire, creating a habit of, when this impulse comes up, when enough action potentials blast through the threshold, I always reach for a ball of beer, or I always want to do this or that, or the wide range of things that
it's reinforced learning, basically.
Reinforced.
Yeah.
So it's interesting.
Oh yeah. So this is classic psychedelics. What's the next page that we...
Page 114 to 117 I have here.
Okay.
Read.
Right. So here's the thing. With classic psychedelics, I mean, okay, you can take high doses of them and that starts to sort of dissolve our ordinary world, but at most doses, we're still in this world that we know. It's just that these novel T states that our brain can take on change our perception. They cause like trace artifacts of motion, like on LSD. They cause patterns to like go in and out on shrooms, like as if patterns are breathing, like objects are breathing, like
expanding and contracting over and over.
Yeah, so these are novel states.
Because new combinations of neurons are being fired together.
Yeah, in his other book, which we'll also do a book report on once Zach gets to it, which is okay because you haven't started yet. So like, we'll get to this in the future. But basically, you can picture these different states that your brain can take on as a landscape of hills and valleys. Under sober conditions, you can picture the hills as being tall and the valleys as being quite low. And to be in one state, let's say a stable state is when I've rolled into a hill. For me to perceive something, it needs to kick me out of that state and into a new state, and it has to give me enough. Has to give my brain enough reason to believe that that thing is real. Let's say like a bird flies into my vision. That sensory information has given me enough confidence to kick out of my current valley, go up a hill, and go into another valley that contains that bird in my reality model. So I trust that that bird's in my reality model. But that took a lot of convincing to my brain to get me out of that one dip up a hill and into another dip containing the bird. Under psychedelics, he basically says that this landscape is flattened, where hills become lower and valleys become higher. They become closer to each other. So you need less kicking out of the valley to get into a new state. And before, whereas my sober brain couldn't scale a mountain to get over it and to observe, like, for instance, my walls breathing, that mountain has become flattened under like mushrooms or something. And my brain will just like walk over to that new state and be completely happy there. And then it can also transition between states much easier as well. So that's this excitability that we're discussing. So I like that picture where you have this landscape of brain states.
So in this landscape, like, is what's physically happening with the structural connectivity? Are new axons meeting new dendrites physically?
No. Structural connectivity does not change on a fast enough timescale to explain a psychedelic experience. It's purely the effective connectivity.
Effective and functional.
Functional, yeah.
Resulting.
Yeah.
So when they say psychedelics make the brain more plastic or neuroplasticity increases,
that's
just the connectivity of the effective connectivity and functional connectivity?
No, so plasticity refers to structural connectivity
that's
changes.
why I asked.
They do say that like mushrooms will change your like brain connections or sometimes even generate new neurons, but that effect is so small
compared to what's happening in the moment.
In the moment. The moment is effective and functional connectivity. That is your reality state. The structural connectivity on any meaningful timescale will be fixed.
So during the trip, effective and functional connectivity change drastically, and structural connectivity changes a bit. But then
structural connectivity
not at all.
You can consider that as not changing.
But long term after that.
Yeah, long term after that.
Is that because new thalamocortical columns fired together, and over time, because those have been accessed in the past through repetition later after the trip, if you revisit the same framework of mind or whatever, those connections will be continuously fired, and then you can continuously build the structural connectivity later on?
Yeah, I think that's quite close. And that might actually explain like acid flashbacks, is that your brain has plastically changed to slightly more preferentially activate those states accessed during your acid trip, and then you don't experience the acid flashback all the time in your daily life, but maybe something will kick you out of your current valley into the valley that exists because of the structural connectivity change, and you can access that state again in your sober life because it was reinforced by the structural connectivity changes. This is just me theorizing. I don't know, but that seems to make sense. Yeah.
It's interesting though how people can have those flashbacks involuntarily because of some external trigger that may or may not have been a trigger during their trip. Mm-hmm. But also, it would seem that they could intentionally access that at any time that they want because that has been accessed before, but that's not the case. People can't just
it's
okay, now go back into how it felt like to be on acid.
I want this exact brain state to happen right now. Like otherwise I could just be blissfully happy, like, pure bliss all the time, like just by will.
Sometimes thinking of a past happy memory though does take you there. Like people say go to your happy place or whatever.
Yeah, like you can modulate it for sure. Yeah, but you can't like
with these drug experiences that have been like a flash in the pan of stimulation, you can't just boom go back there now.
Yeah,
Whereas a happy memory sober, you can go back there. I've gone back to many past memories that are happy, and
yeah, you can go
it's no
back to the
problem.
memory, but you can't like put your full brain state in that mode. You can
Right.
you can pull from the memory, and it's like just an artifact of what was there, but
it's not
it's
the
not
exact experience ever, because our brain is filling in the blanks.
and
anyway.
you're not like, memories are weird because it's like, oh, I can visualize myself driving my like car in high school, but I'm not seeing that. I'm still seeing you. Like, it's weird. It's weird recalling a memory because it's, where is that like perception? It's just like I'm pulling like some trace artifacts from it, but it's not manifesting in the same phenomenal way that you're manifesting right now. So it's weird, completely trippy.
The section of this book when it said the brain does not is not like a projector screen putting things
Mhm.
in front of a thing, I almost disagree with that, because that's how memories feel to me. It's like there's some sort of internal projector that I'm not seeing necessarily with my senses, but I'm able to visualize.
I think he's saying that there's no region of the brain in which all of the information is
Unified together.
being unified and projected onto like
screen.
as a screen or something.
But it almost feels that way is what I'm saying.
It's like what's really happening is that the connectivity between all of your regions of brain are the projector screen, more or less.
Yeah, but also the thalamus. Why does information go from the cortex to the thalamus always? That seems like it would be that central regional area.
Yeah, I think it has a large part to do with it.
So it's
But-
almost like the effect of a projector screen is what I
Yeah,
was
yeah,
thinking
but,
when he was talking about thalamocortical loops and how everything stimulated in the cortex needs to go through the thalamus and then back to the cortex to create this loop. It's like, okay, well then it's unifying everything at a central place like a fucking projector screen. It's weird.
Yeah.
I know what he's saying. Like, you can't literally have an exact visualization of a memory in your mind unified perfectly, but it's essentially the essence of that
Yeah, yeah.
with the
it's-
thalamus.
It's in essence, I think I agree, but it gets tricky and
Yeah.
like normative, as we were talking about before,
Yeah.
almost too.
He's smarter in that shit than I am. This
Yeah.
is like me pulling shit out of my ass, but that's just how it seems.
Yeah.
From experience. Okay. Did you read all those pages, or did you
No, I
pause?
didn't. We didn't get to DMT yet.
Okay. What page are you on?
I think 115.
Okay, continue.
Okay. Let me see. Okay, maybe I'll just start a bit earlier to intro DMT a bit. So, LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, and DMT are the big four classic psychedelics, each built from either a tryptamine or phenethylamine nucleus, but each with its own characteristic way of affecting the brain and changing the phenomenal world. However, the effects of DMT on the structure of the world are far more dramatic than those produced by normal doses of LSD, psilocybin, or mescaline. All psychedelics, including the many novel drugs derived from classic psychedelics, modify the information generated by the brain and, in so doing, modify the world. Usually the world that manifests under the influence of a classic psychedelic is an altered version of the consensus world. DMT, however, is exceptional. Given a sufficient dose, around 30 to 50 milligrams for an average person, the world is not changed, but rather replaced entirely. Whereas the other psychedelics partially reduce the mutual information between the brain and the environment, DMT reduces this information to zero. DMT is a 100% reality channel switch. The DMT worlds bear no relationship whatsoever to consensus reality. Can you read from 115 at this point? I just need water. My throat is going.
What were the last two words you said?
Sorry?
What was the last paragraph ending with?
Page 115. It starts with initially.
Initially, the Voyager is hurtled through a rapidly changing procession of complex visual imagery, described by Timothy Leary as being fired out of a muzzle of an atomic cannon with Neo-Byzantine barreling, and often accompanied by a distinctive metallic buzzing or whirling sound as the drug takes hold. If the dose is sufficient, this complexity eventually gives way and the user bursts through a veil or membrane, sometimes heralded by a popping sound, into a completely novel domain of impossible dimensionality and teeming with entities of immense intelligence and power. Many DMT trips falter before reaching this breakthrough phase, and the user is dragged back into the consensus world without having reached the other side of the veil. However, if the dose is properly prepared, the vaporization technique properly honed, and the lungs well seasoned, entry into the DMT hyperspace is assured.
Okay, I can take over. Okay, so continuing on. During normal waking life, your phenomenal world is constructed by your brain as a model of your environment, the surrounding grid. In the same way, hyperspace refers to the phenomenal world experienced during a DMT trip and is a model of a higher dimensional environment to which DMT gates access. In later chapters, he discusses this. We'll get into that pretty soon here. Once breakthrough is achieved, transfer to hyperspace is rapid and complete, as if the consensus world has been switched off and an entirely new world switched on. Users typically describe this thoroughly alien world as being more real than ordinary waking reality, and the lucidity of the experience is striking, with trippers typically able to experience the bizarre effects as if in an ordinary waking state. Not all DMT users enter the same type of world, and of course we shouldn't expect that everyone thrust into an alternate reality ought to have exactly the same type of experience. If an alien was dropped onto a random place on Earth, his experience would depend on the geographical location he happened to touch down upon. The region of DMT hyperspace that users find themselves tumbling into is largely, at least in inexperienced users, beyond their control, as are the types of entities encountered. With experience, however, some users can learn to direct their journey towards specific areas of hyperspace and into meetings with certain types of intelligent entity. Entry into hyperspace, especially the first time, is almost invariably accompanied by a feeling of overwhelming shock and astonishment. This is a normal reaction. These worlds are not just strange, but ineffably bizarre and seemingly impossible in their complexity and construction. Most users describe an unshakable feeling of absolute authenticity and the undeniable presence of extreme intelligence beyond anything that could be experienced in the consensus world. The apparent impossibility of these worlds and their content stems partly from two characteristic features of the DMT hyperspace that distinguish it from consensus reality: inordinate complexity and the perception of higher spatial dimensions, example, beyond 3. This complexity doesn't manifest as unbridled chaos or random configurations of bright colors and geometric forms, but, in the words of author Graham Hancock, these worlds are highly artificial, constructed, inorganic, and technological. There is an undeniable sense that these realms are not merely novel domains of the mind, but alien habitats constructed by a hyper-intelligent hand, complete with the jeweled cityscapes and whistling machinery of a highly advanced alien society. The ferocity of the initial entry phase into hyperspace will often overwhelm even the most seasoned traveler, and neophytes are advised against trying to make sense of their new hyperdimensional surroundings or to control the experience. At least for the first few journeys, it is advisable to relax as much as possible and simply observe. Often the construction of the DMT space rapidly transcends the merely remarkable and moves into the unambiguously impossible. A traveler is transported into realms of apparently higher dimensional structure or presented with objects that defy the geometrical constraints of our universe. It isn't unusual for trippers to recount seeing objects from all sides at once, or observing additional spatial dimensions beyond the usual 3. The direct perception of higher dimensional, i.e. above 3 spatial dimensions, objects is not possible within our 3-dimensional reality. In fact, such objects are difficult to envisage at all, and the experience of doing so is almost always confounding. A 3D reality is subsumed by any higher dimensional system, in the same way our 3D world subsumes a lower dimensional one, such as a 2D flatland world. This not only provides an important clue as to the nature of the DMT world and its relationship to ours, but also as to the true structure of our brain complex. We will explore this in chapters to come, etc. So,
okay, I'll take over here. In addition to their inordinately complex structure, the hyperdimensional DMT worlds are made all the more compelling by their occupants. Just as a sprawling alien cityscape would reveal the nature of its architects and residents before a single soul was seen, so the presence of supreme intelligence is felt from the earliest stages of the trip. Once they make their appearance, entities range from savage insectoid and reptilian aliens to benevolent amorphous beings of light. But by far the most famous denizens of these fantastical realms are the spiritly mischievous
Sprightly.
beings often described as elves. Whilst ubiquitous, they appear in a variety of forms, ranging from amorphous balls of colorful light to the classic elves of Celtic folklore. Despite this variability, they seem to be unified by their playful character. The elves will often vie for the attention of the tripper and delight in demonstrating their skills, such as singing impossible hyperdimensional objects into existence, or leaping in and out of the tripper's chest with much glee.
Closer.
Whilst the elfin ones are some of the kookiest occupants of the DMT space, for many they are generally seen as little more than a distraction from the more powerful beings that inhabit these realms. A comprehensive survey of the fauna would include a bewildering array of creatures: insectoids, reptilians, and serpents, elves, goblins, and jesters, aliens, humanoid and otherwise, robots and cyborgs, spirits, angels, demons, gods, and many other beings that defy categorization. For any experienced voyager, it is clear that DMT hyperspace is not a luminal realm populated entirely by beneficial gods of light, but an extremely complex, varied, and vast hyperdimensional ecology populated by creatures that vary as much in their character and intent as their outward form. The interactions between the tripper and these beings are, more often than not, positive. Often the tripper will find himself being carried or guided by a particular entity acting as a wise elder or protective spirit guide, eager to impart profound insights into the nature of reality, insights most trippers struggle to carry back into the consensus world. Occasionally, the more lively entities appear simply to delight in the opportunity to show the visitor around the wacky circus. Of course, not all interactions are positive, and whilst violent aggression is, fortunately, not that common, non-human entities with some degree of malevolent intent, or at least that are visually objectionable or performing some unpleasant act on the user, are not infrequently encountered. The curiosity of an entity, which might initially be expressed by a gentle probing, can sometimes progress to something more invasive. Outright violence or maliciousness is rare but possible, and it takes both experience and a strong constitution to deal with entities manifesting in this way. Pause. There have been trip reports where people are literally getting fucked by massive insectoid beings, like praying mantises fucking you in the ass, or like some traumatic shit can happen. Like,
that's kind of but like the
what are you gonna say? That's kind of cool.
No. That's kind of badass.
Not cool to me at all.
No, consent is badass.
Consent is badass. Consent, homie of the show.
Consent. I don't know what I was gonna say, but it does seem that like those are more rare, but okay, those have been reported, so hopefully that doesn't happen.
So okay, guys, if we're really tapping into to other dimensions where beings literally exist somewhere in space or somewhere on another planet or somewhere in another dimension, they vary in their behavior just like a human being would. So even like the same types of insects, because later in that trip report about the insects fucking this guy, he was saying they later like became his friend and started sharing profound insights. So it's just like maybe they just wanted to get jiggy with it, and then like maybe that's how they show affection, like. But it could be traumatic for people because this is like very real seeming, and the brain is generating, unfortunately, some scary things as well. But yeah, it's very interesting. So the full array of different types of beings could be experienced.
I can finish off this.
This page has one sentence left.
Yeah,
one of the most.
Wait,
what?
I'll just do it because it carries on to the next page, and then the chapter's done. So, One of the most uncanny types of experience reported by a striking number of DMT users is not only the sense that the entities were expectant of their visit, but of a great celebratory uproar upon breaking through into the space. Quote, they kept saying welcome back, and words like, the big winner, he has returned, welcome to the end and the beginning, you are the one. As I looked around the room, I felt the sense of some huge celebration upon my entry to this place. Bells were ringing, lights flashing, end quote. That's pretty cool, man.
So cool.
Yeah, okay. So this is often accompanied by a profound sense of déjà vu, the unshakable feeling that one has been there before. Although the incomprehensible strangeness of the DMT hyperspace is astounding, the existence of such worlds is not the most astounding revelation afforded by DMT. After all, even the most conservative of physicists would struggle to rule out the possible existence of parallel worlds inhabited by advanced alien intelligences. No, the most astonishing revelation is not the existence of such worlds, but that we have the ability to access them with such facility by inhaling a couple of lungfuls of one of the simplest and most common molecules in the plant kingdom. It seems impossible to fathom how, when perturbed by such a simple molecule, the human mind can reach into such parallel dimensions of reality and meet intelligent beings that exist entirely independent of us. However, we must realize that DMT was embedded in our reality for precisely this reason, to enable us to access the hyperdimensional realm lying orthogonal to ours. Rather than an alien realm, this is the realm from which we have become alienated, and the realm to which we will ultimately return. So, that gets into some crazy conjecture type territory, but it's like, again, as he's saying, even, what does he say? Even the most conservative of physicists would struggle to rule out that these other realms could exist. So it's like, yeah.
Could be there, guys. Probably is. So before we get into the next thing, which is upwards and downwards information flow, like some of these trip reports that you hear about, they typically talk about when you first go into a DMT realm, so a new user enters a certain space, a lot of the times the beings that you encounter are shocked to see you. Like, you catch them off guard. They either are startled or they immediately start doing experiments on you to see if you're a threat of some sort. And when they realize you're not, it also varies. So some of the beings leave you alone and just let you do your own thing. Other beings are delighted to see that you are not malevolent, and they see that you're an innocent or benevolent being, and they start sharing insights with you, and they're very interested in you. And then in future times that you take DMT, a lot of people who are repeated users go back to the same realms, and they continue the lessons with the same beings and left off where they started.
You gotta look up Tales. I think I sent you this, Tales from the Trip on YouTube.
Yeah.
With Shane Moss having a purple DMT girlfriend who's jealous of his real world girlfriend.
Right, I've heard of
so
that.
Fucking funny.
It's crazy. And then
she's like this multi-dimensional god that he's just like hooking up with in DMT space.
Like sexually?
Yeah, it's like his girlfriend in DMT realm.
That's so funny.
And she's like pissed when he comes back because he has another girlfriend in real world.
It's hilarious. Yeah, it's nuts what's going on with some of these trips. Other times you re-enter the DMT space in the same realm where you left off, and the same beings will see you, but they'll be like, we already checked you out before. Like, they lose interest. So it varies drastically on people's experience, and it varies drastically with their repeated experiencers. Yeah, we can continue. So upwards and downwards information flow.
Okay, so what we want to talk about is we've talked about hierarchies before, where you have local interacting agents. So let's talk about the flock of birds. So there's a bunch of birds, like thousands of birds, and they're all just interacting locally and updating their flight path based on what their neighbors are doing. That generates a hierarchy from like single bird level to like group of bird level to entire flock level. Like, this is a hierarchy of information flow, and that's called upwards information flow. The information from the individual bird is flowing upwards in the hierarchy to dictate what the overall flock is doing. So that overall flock layer can be thought of as its own entity that is doing its own thing. But this is where downwards information flow comes in, is that what the flock is currently doing as a whole propagates downwards and dictates what each individual bird is doing. Like, for instance, a bird in the middle of the flock is not just freely able to fly a kilometer away on its own. It's constrained by the boundaries of the flock and what the flock is currently doing. So not only are the birds generating the flock, then the flock is downward causally dictating what the birds, and we could say constraining each bird's subsequent states are. So that's the downward information flow here.
Very good explanation. You did better than Gallimore in the book on that.
Thank you. Okay, I don't know if we want to like read from here. I think that's like...
I want to chime in on the upwards and downwards information flow.
Yes,
so
sir.
when you ingest DMT, DMT is a molecule, so it affects us on the molecular level first. But then the information that DMT holds goes downwards, down to the atoms, down to the subatomic particles, down to the grid or the code that is generating this reality, potentially. And then it's also going upwards and affecting our state of mind. Now, all things in life have this upward and downward information flow.
Yeah,
everything
in these complex systems, yeah, it's like...
everything is affecting everything in every direction.
Yeah.
All the time. But...
So, I want to say one quick thing.
I want to say some shit, man.
Wait, just one quick thing. The thing that exists is the local low-level, like, cells or grid, or, like, in the flock. It's just the birds that exist. So it's almost an illusion that the high level of the hierarchy exists, because at the end of the day, it's just the birds. But it's the structure of it that is considered to be real, and then causing this downward information flow. So at the end of the day, it's just the grid that exists. But you can think of information as taking on new forms in this hierarchy and generating new levels of the hierarchy, and then causing downward information flow back down to the grid. But at the end of the day, it's still just the grid at the base level.
You're saying that's the only level that's truly real?
Yeah.
You said some shit about consciousness being the most fundamental thing earlier.
Yeah.
Is consciousness the grid? In your
my
informed personal opinion.
I think...
or is consciousness the hypergrid or the code? The code underlies the grid, right?
Yeah.
The digital code that we were talking about at the beginning of the episode.
Yeah, so here's where...
Is consciousness the digital code, or is it different? Does consciousness generate the code? Is there even...
I don't know. I'm
level?
thinking right now. Let me think.
You don't have to answer right now, but these are questions that we need to consider. What's the foundation? Math, consciousness? We don't know.
Yeah. So it seems, at least from our perspective, that our conscious experience is what exists. Like, I am having a conscious experience. It's like the Descartes thing. Like, I think, therefore I am. This is the reality I have access to. This is all I know for certain, is that I'm having an experience right now. I don't know that spatial objects exist for sure. Like, these are all... My brain feels like there's objects out there that are the grid, for instance. But fundamentally, the consciousness is more relevant or more believable.
More foundational.
So in terms of like this grid model, where my brain went was, how are rules imposed upon the grid? Like, where do the rules exist? The rules must be outside of the system. So if you have a 3D grid of cells, like, where are the rules if only the cells exist, right? So like the cells have to know how to update from state to state. So where are the rules contained?
In a higher dimension. Just like if we write a 2D cellular automata program with 4 rules, the rules reside in the 3rd dimension while the 2D automata updates.
So my idea is that consciousness is what fundamentally exists. Consciousness imposes the rules.
Oh yeah.
And what we experience is what it is like to update a rule, or to update cell states according to these rules. So you can think of like what really exists as some like weird realm of consciousness, which I don't know what that looks like. But there's structure there that it can impose the action of rules upon, I guess, if we're working in this model, this grid system, and it does that at every grid position. And when you get a organization of information within some like 3D cluster of the grid, like let's say this is my brain in the 3D cluster of the grid, like my physical brain, like all the neurons and stuff are contained in some 3D region of this grid. Those grid cells update according to rules. And so like I, as a conscious agent, am not my physical brain. I am what it is like to update that physical brain according to these rules. So I am the rule updates, and I perceive my conscious states as manifesting through time as I update the cells from state to state. So I'm an external, fundamentally different conscious agent outside of this 3D world,
but inside of it as well.
Yeah, exactly. So the information flow is all happening inside of this 3D world, and what I'm experiencing is happening because of the states of that 3D world. But the consciousness itself is those rule updates, and what I perceive as time is the cells updating through iteration to iteration.
I love that idea. So what I'm hearing is you as a conscious agent are the cause or the rules, and the brain and the 3D world is the effect.
Yeah. I'd have to think about this some more, but yeah, I think.
I know we talked about this once before when you first told me about that. This is mind-blowing shit, if that's what it is. Well, which I have a lot of good feelings around this. It logically makes sense. It feels right internally, even intuitively.
Yeah, because right now, like in our current world model, like in normal physics paradigms, not the one we're talking about in this book, consciousness is not explained adequately. Like, I mean, by consciousness, I mean phenomenal consciousness, like this, like the colors and smells and like the experience of
living,
of the experience of seeing the color red, the experience of tasting chocolate. Like, these are not accounted for whatsoever.
With science,
with science, or with arrangements of particles and whatnot. And then when we get to the model portrayed in this book, where you have 3D grid of cell states, like that is information, as we've discussed. But where is the perception in there? Where is the experience? Where is the consciousness? To me, it seems somewhat natural to say, well, something has to exist outside of that system to enforce the rules, or to at least define the rules in the first place. Like,
there needs to be a writer of the program in order to hit run on the program.
Yeah. So that's where I'm going with that, is like, okay, if consciousness can't be explained from just the grid cells themselves, and you need something to enforce the rules, okay, maybe there's a candidate there. I don't know. We'll think about that more.
So this is where it could be several different things. Like we said, it could be alien intelligences. It could be higher aspects of our own selves that created this as a simulation for ourselves to jump in and experience. It could be, I say higher aspects of our own selves, that could mean soul aspects or consciousness or whatever you want to call it, whatever label you want to stick on there. Or it could be some sort of God-type entity, or it could be a collective of God-type entities or just creators. that is to be determined and experienced more than anything. Don't believe anything. Experience, guys.
Don't believe Zach, guys.
Don't believe me. Go take the drugs and tell it for yourself. Come to your own conclusion, or meditate deeply, or just let it go if you don't actually care to find out and you like to just live in this unknown realm. I don't. I want to get to the fucking the brass tacks. But it's fascinating. Going back to upwards and downwards information flow. So we talked about DMT changing things down to the basis of reality. And now that we say it, we went down to, yes, the code, which could be the foundation of reality, but even below that could be consciousness. I was going to draw a conclusion that we can't just stop at the brain as being the highest level that's affected here, because upwards information flow goes from the DMT, for example, up into the brain complex, but beyond that, above whatever the brain is, that might be a soul or a consciousness entity that resides in another dimension. It could also be above that to another God entity, but wait a second, that was the lowest thing as well. So I'm just connecting these things. Maybe that's where infinity ties in on itself, where it's the foundation of reality and also the highest aspect of reality, creating a full circle, which I'll get into how circles fucking
a circle.
A circle, yeah. As wise man Rob Schneider once said in Chuck and Larry.
It's a circle.
Seriously though.
Okay, wait, we're breaking for pizza. Be right back.
I'm not breaking. Go get the pizza. This is some deep ass shit, guys. That a pizza as well is in a circle for a good reason. Why does everyone love pizza? Because it tastes good, but probably also because it's a circle. Anyways, this is some groundbreaking shit that I've never thought of. So the foundation of what is affected with the lowest aspect of reality is likely consciousness, for the reasons we said. The highest aspect of what's being affected is likely consciousness as well. Even if you disagree with both of those statements, information, regardless of what level it enters our system, our being, information, whether it's an apple that we eat and the nutrients going downwards from the molecular level to the atomic level to the subatomic level and providing our body with sustenance, or going upwards and providing our brain state with energy. In both cases, there's upwards and downwards information flow.
What the hell are you talking about? I just got back. I'm just kidding.
I'm just finishing off the idea of upwards and downwards information flow and how pizza is a circle.
A circle.
Anyways. Okay, so that was upwards and downwards information flow. So next, Jordan is going to read page 149.
One what?
And talk about brain perturbation patterns. Or perturbation.
I think you're jumping ahead a bit.
Brain
I think
patterns.
We're on like 139 maybe?
149.
No, but we have to explain how rules can change and stuff.
Okay, carry on.
Carry on. Okay, so let me just summarize and just get us up to speed of where we're at in terms of like the model for this reality. So our reality under this model is some 3D configuration of cells, and there are rules that dictate the transition of cell state in state 1 to state 2 to state 3, and that proceeds in this 3D grid, much like the game of life is a 2D rule-based cellular automata with on and off states and 4 rules. Our universe is quite a bit more complex. It's 3 dimensions where each cell interacts with not only its neighbors in 2D, but also the neighbors above it and below it. And then presumably in our universe, the rules are more complex. There's probably more than 4 rules. And
Probably many states.
And the states are much more complex, as hinted by our like standard model of physics.
What I wanted to jump in with about that earlier is Federico Fagin, who helped invent the microprocessor, has been researching what our reality is coded in, and he thought for the longest time that it is coded like computers in binary bits, but he has come to the conclusion that it's coded in quantum bits, which would mean not just ones and zeros, but infinite variable states.
Right. Yeah. So we can have an episode about that stuff as well.
We will. So that just shows how many different variabilities we can have here in our realm. But continue.
Okay. Yeah. So our grid that we find ourselves in a daily life can be explained just by like a 3D grid of cells, and then these cells interact with their local neighbors by some rules that you could call the laws of physics. The cell states you could call the particles within the standard model of physics, and then these proceed through their rule-based interactions. So the core idea of the book here is that there's no reason that the true reality should be just limited to a three-dimensional grid. We can imagine easily that these could extend into higher dimensions. Obviously, we can't visualize like 4D, 5D, anything above 3D, at least in our sober state. But mathematically, these are very easy to describe. You can describe 4-dimensional spaces and 4-dimensional objects in those spaces and do math in higher dimensions. So with the grid, you can imagine orthogonal dimensions in 4 plus D. So this is where the book is kind of going, is that under normal circumstances, the rules are such that cells only interact with their 3-dimensional neighborhood. But because the 4-dimensional neighborhood exists and are in contact with every cell at all times, if the rules were just right, you could set the rules to allow information to flow among different dimensions. To help introduce this in the book, he uses 2 dimensions because we can visualize 2 dimensions, and then we can visualize the 3rd dimension as being that higher dimension to it. So, for instance, we've described the game of life, so we can just think about that for now. You have a 2D set of cells that are on this infinite 2-dimensional grid, and they interact with their neighbors to the left, right, forwards, and backwards. But there's no up and down neighbors on the game of life. But we can start to add a 3rd dimension to the game of life by just making the grid go up and down. So we add a 3rd dimension of grid, so now they're just cubic cells, which is, again, presumably what our universe that we perceive is. So the normal game of life in 2D operates as it does, and that's behaving normally. There's no rule in its current formulation that gates in any information of cells above or below the 2-dimensional normal game of life. But I could, in theory, construct some rules that allow the cell states above the plane of game of life and below the plane of the game of life to inform what goes on in the game of life. I could set those arbitrarily just right now. I could say if you get if you imagine a 3x3 cube, or a 3x3 square, on the game of life, you could have a rule that says if a square is all lit up, if all 9 cells of this 3x3 square are lit up, there's a rule that says look at the cell above in the 3rd dimension, and if that cell is on, then I turn the cell off or something. So this is an extra rule to the game of life, where Zach defined those 4 rules earlier. This is an extra rule that says under a specific circumstance of the current grid in the game of life, we can gate information from this third dimension that was previously inaccessible. So I've added a new rule. Now we can read information from up and from below. So this was previously not allowed before. So what these are called are, where is this? So these are called pattern rule mappings. So reading from the book, he says, we could also design an automaton whereby certain state patterns, rather than simply, let me just skip up a bit. So yeah, certain state patterns trigger the adoption of specific rule sets according to some pattern to rule mapping. He illustrates this using the 1D automaton, but then also the 2D automata that I was just describing with the game of life. We can visualize that as well. And what he's proposing here is that we exist in a 3-dimensional reality that is in contact with a 4-dimensional grid of cells, but the rules are such that under most circumstances we don't gate information from those 4D cell states. So our universe does not interact with those dimensions under most circumstances. But here's where he introduces the perturbation brain pattern, where if you construct the current brain pattern, so my brain or Zach's brain, in the proper circumstance, and the proposition is that under the DMT state, that the DMT causes a pattern of information to manifest in our 3D grid, and that changes the rules locally for certain cells of the grid to then access information from these 4 or higher dimensional layers of the grid. And now the current rules, like you could call it the current laws of physics, are not limited by what they typically are, but rather they're expanded to incorporate information flowing. You could think of it as an external input, such as sensory information. But the sensory information is not limited to 3D. It's coming from 4 dimensions and higher. And this also simultaneously, because of upwards and downwards information flow, this is simultaneously changing what our brain currently is. So our brain under sober circumstances would be a 3-dimensional brain, but because we're connected now to these higher dimensions, the brain itself and the patterns of information in the brain are now considered higher dimensional. So for me, let's say Zach was doing DMT, I'm watching him, I'm constrained to 3D. He looks like he's constrained to 3D, but I can't see that 4th dimension that his brain is interacting with, because those are local rule changes that only he can observe from within his intrinsic perspective. So I'll flip around a bit, think about what I want to talk about next, but is there anything that comes to mind, Zach?
I'll basically say the same thing that Jordan just said in a different way. So these perturbation brain patterns are essentially disruptions in the regular activity of the brain, where a specific section of the brain will start operating by a different rule set, with the new rules allowing us to take in information from higher dimensions in our brain. This stimulates an entirely new set of thalamocortical columns in the brain, hence giving us an entirely new repertoire of thalamocortical states to experience, meaning we experience a reality entirely different than the one we're used to. Completely new information is coming in, and our brain is processing it in mostly new ways than how it's used to processing information. A completely new world is generated because of this.
Nice. So, where next in the book?
So in the book, we were going to continue to how DMT may be a gateway to the other dimensions of hyperspace, which is basically what we're already talking about.
Yeah.
So that would start from, I was going to read page 158.
Okay.
Did you want to read anything from 149 or?
No, I think that was still... Oh, wait, let me see. Yeah, let me just to like cement in this idea of like, so he calls these dynamic rule sets. Let's just use like the example of chess. So chess has its rules. I can move the pieces in certain ways that are predefined. But I could now, let's say, change those rules. I could change them from my external perspective. I could just say, I'm external to this system, so I have access to the rules. I can make it so that the knight, instead of moving 2 squares up and 1 to the left or right, let's say I'll change that and it can go 3 squares up and 1 to the left or right. So I have access to changing the rules. So that would be a dynamic rule change in the system. That's a bit complex. That requires external information. Like it requires me as an external entity to change the rules. You could hard code in what he defines as these pattern rule mappings, where you don't need an external observer or external agent to change the rules arbitrarily. You can make it so that the rules automatically change when a certain pattern is reached on the chessboard. So let's say like both my knights get to like a5 and d7 or something, and then the other opponent's knights are on like b6 and h1 or something, like just random, like if some weird funky chess board configuration is reached, then a certain rule change kicks in. So that could be hard coded in from the get-go, like from day one. And chess players could go millennia never reaching that certain pattern to kick in the rule change. So you might have to like experiment around it. Like let's say I knew a certain position on the chessboard would kick in a rule change. It would be impossible to find that random position because there's so much information on the 64 squares plus all the possible cell states that it's basically impossible to find a particular pattern like randomly. But
what we did by tickling a toad and getting it to excrete venom, which we then smoked. And
exactly, so that's the thing. Yeah.
Dimension.
It's like this is also what Gallimore proposes, is that this is considered the cosmic game, which is like we had to have developed enough intelligence to find this DMT molecule and to learn how to use it and smoke it and gain access to these dimensions or something. So yeah, the principle that he describes is a pattern rule mapping, where if once your brain achieves a certain pattern, the rules can change and gate information from the orthogonal dimensions. Okay. Take it away, Zach.
Before I take it away, I just want to mention the DMT that Gallimore is talking about in this book is NN-DMT, so that one is not gained from tickling a toad and getting its venom. It is in most plants, and it is typically synthesized in a lab and purified, and then taken through either smoked through a vaporizer in the form of vapor or burned in a pipe and inhaled. Just wanted to clarify that because, yeah, they are quite different experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And, yeah, so carrying on with the book, all forms emergent on the grid of our universe are unified by their fundamental nature as information complexes. Structures built from information itself, instantiated by the cell states from which the grid is constructed. From the simplest first-order structures to the most supremely complex living organisms with many layers of hierarchical organization, all are fundamentally cell-based structures that receive and process information from the surrounding grid and the other structures co-emergent in it. This is also true of the hypergrid, the hyperdimensional system also generated from the code of which the grid is a lower dimensional slice. It ought to be obvious that the dimensionality of an information complex will correspond to the dimensionality of the slice upon which it emerges and is embedded. Entering the DMT space means confronting a world that is not only startlingly complex, bizarre, and teeming with apparently hyper-intelligent living beings, but which is entirely impossible. Indeed, these worlds are impossible from the perspective of a conscious being that emerged in a lower dimensional reality. The information complexes you will meet and interact with in the DMT space, the elves and their curious objects, the impossibly constructed hallways and jeweled temples, emerged or were constructed by emergent intelligences embedded in the hypergrid, and as such are higher dimensional structures that are beyond inconceivable for a grid-based organism. Whilst many mathematicians routinely work in higher dimensional spaces, and passable renderings of a four-dimensional forms such as the Terrasect hypercube, Tesseract, thank you. These things give us an idea of the structure of a four-dimensional object. It's certainly not possible for a 3D brain complex to envisage 4, 5, 6, or 7-dimensional objects and organisms other than in complete abstraction. So when a machine elf gleefully tosses you a 7-dimensional egg across a 9-dimensional room, it's thoroughly confounding. Whether you are immersed in the mundanities of your regular life in this universe or dancing with reptilians in the DMT worlds, the phenomenal world you experience is always constructed by the most complex of all information complexes emergent on the grid, your brain. A brain is a special type of information complex in that it is adapted to receive, process, and store large amounts of information from the environment, the surrounding grid. This information manifests as the phenomenal world experienced by the brain. By modulating or stimulating the patterns of information it generates and activating the encoded pattern rule mappings, DMT gates the flow of information from the normally inaccessible orthogonal dimensions of the hypergrid into the brain. This causes the brain to cease building the consensus world and to begin constructing the thoroughly alien, higher dimensional DMT worlds experienced as hyperspace. To achieve this, the brain doesn't simply passively absorb the hyperdimensional information, but actually undergoes a transformation in its most fundamental, lowest level structure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, at the end of the next paragraph he says, in the presence of DMT, the brain re-emerges from cell states sensitive to the hypergrid's orthogonal higher dimensions. The brain is transformed into a higher dimensional processor within the hypergrid. So
basically what we were saying before, it's affecting the lowest level structure, the lowest level fundamental structure of reality, but also with the upwards information flow.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Go ahead.
Where next? I'm losing steam here. Should I give the summary yet, or are we?
Just double checking my notes here. Speaking of upwards and downwards information flow, so this top-down and bottom-up impact creates a loop where the more the physical apparatus or the brain is perturbed or disrupted, the more information can flow into it from the other dimensions of the hypergrid. And the more information that flows in from the hypergrid, the more the brain's thalamocortical columns are stimulated until we are totally gone into another world, completely perceiving an entirely new set of information from a vast number of other dimensions. So
Hell yeah.
The more it's perturbed, more information comes in. The more information that comes in, the more it becomes perturbed. And so it just creates this loop that deepens us into the DMT experience until we're totally immersed in it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's everything I had. If you want to sum it up, is that page 198?
Yeah, page 198. So he gives a nice little summary here. So in short, we live in a reality constructed from digital information instantiated by a code programmed by an alien hyperintelligence. The code programs the structure of our reality as a digital object constructed as one of a vast number of lower dimensional slices, grids, of a structure known as the hypergrid. The grid and the hypergrid is encoded as a network of fundamental cells or nodes connected according to a rule set. This connectivity allows information to flow between cells or nodes and throughout the hypergrid. However, the flow of information between the grid and the hypergrid is normally restricted to three-dimensional cell or node states, insensitive to orthogonal dimensions of the hypergrid. The cells or nodes, with their connectivity, form a spatial topology that determines the dimensionality of the space that emerges as the grid runs. Being within a lower dimensional slice of the hypergrid, emergent organisms such as ourselves experience a space with a commensurately lower dimensionality than beings emergent in the hypergrid. Even the most complex structures that appear in our world and others can be seen to emerge through many layers of hierarchical complexity, from the hypergrid to the subatomic to the organismic level. This includes the brain complex, which is built from information and is an extremely complex information generator. Everything is a manifestation of the complexification of information. Information is dynamic and flows through the hypergrid, both within organizational layers and between them. The upwards and downwards flow of information is crucial for the self-organization of complex, including living, systems. As brain complexes emerge and evolve, they eventually construct a model of reality experienced as a phenomenal world. This subjective world is built from vast amounts of information, which the brain generates by selecting T-states from an astronomical number of potential states, and thus ruling out extremely large numbers of states. Psychedelic molecules modify the information generated by a brain, modifying the structure and dynamics of its phenomenal world. The key requirement for transport to an alternate orthogonal dimension of the hypergrid is the transfer of information from normally hidden dimensions into the brain complex. This is achieved using pattern rule mappings that map the perturbation patterns generated by the brain in the presence of DMT to rules that engender the emergence of cell or node states sensitive to these higher dimensions that gate the flow of information from the hypergrid into the brain. Once information begins flowing from orthogonal dimensions of the hypergrid into the brain complex, upwards and downwards information flow establishes a feedback loop that locks the brain complex in the higher dimensional state, building hyperspace until DMT is removed. Okay.
Crazy. Amazing.
Crazy.
So I hope in this episode you guys walk away with a greater appreciation of what the brain does for you on a day-to-day basis, which is always generating your world. Everything outside of us as a human being is just a data structure, but we have the hardware to translate that information to something comprehensible so that we can survive. I hope there's even greater appreciation for the fact that there are likely other dimensions out there beyond what we perceive. I hope you guys realize that we're not saying to just go out and do drugs and escape this reality. There's a lot of thalamocortical states or states of being that are beautiful in this reality, and it's like life is fucking magical, guys. Like there's so much to experience and appreciate and just be with so many great people, so many amazing things. But one of those amazing things is also psychedelics, where we can explore other realities and gain a deeper understanding of what it means to be alive and what consciousness is. It potentially is the foundation of our reality, and is potentially the highest dimension also that you can
also
go to.
Also lowest.
Highest and lowest. Who knows? Maybe there's something to that. Maybe there's not. But
it's Shircle.
This book is definitely worth a read. Again, Alien Information Theory by Andrew R. Gallimore. Anything you'd like to say, Jordan?
Yeah, just to again. Okay, yeah. So like a lot of what we said here is quite robust science, and like particularly the the brain level stuff, and how, for instance, like cellular automata work, all the things we said about information, like the upwards and downwards hierarchical structures of information, with like the flocks of birds and things like that. Where it gets into conjecture territory is, first of all, assuming that our world is a digital, like grid-like system. That is currently not a bad option in physics. There's a field called digital physics, which people are exploring. It's not the most commonly accepted model of reality because it does have certain failures in terms of predicting and accounting for physical symmetries that we know exist. But there's certain models of it that are commensurate to our observations. So it's still being worked on by lots of people in quite amount of detail. I mean, yeah, and then from there, the DMT gating information from other dimensions is again just like the theory that's being put forth to explain the phenomena. This is based on the premise that these higher dimensions are inaccessible by our current brain structures. Lots of scientists would argue that our brain structures are capable of generating such experiences, but this gets into really messy territory, and lots of debates are surrounding this, particularly dependent on what your ontology is of the world, of whether we're in, like, if 3 dimensions is it, or if there's more dimensions. And then can we access those dimensions? Like, this gets very messy, but I think this is a fun endeavor. I love reading this book, even if it does seem like far-fetched. It's just cool to think about certain systems that can support potential hypotheses, and think about larger structures that are likely present in the universe. Like, some of the best physicists are working on structures beyond space and time right now, to explain a lot of the shortcomings of our physical theories. So it's not all like wacky. Definitely appears wacky, and maybe it is wacky, but it's like we're just trying to, gain more knowledge about our experience and try to answer as many questions as we can before we, nod off to the grave. So just here for
reemerge in another dimension, you mean?
Yeah, that's right. So
very well said. So yeah, we covered information and rule-based systems. Jordan gave the chessboard example. I also talked about information flow, and used the examples of light coming through our eyes and sound coming through our telephone and through our ears. We talked about cellular automata, and we talked about Conway's Game of Life, which is a form of cellular automata, how it has the 4 rules, and based on these 4 rules, we can have highly complex patterns emerging. We then got into how the brain is constantly creating worlds, whether we're awake or asleep and dreaming, or under the influence of psychedelics. We talked about how the brain has developed in a very particular way over the course of evolution to perceive very specific information necessary for evolution, and how it does this through thalamocortical columns being activated, which are just stacks of neurons that create a thalamocortical state that we experience as our state of being. We then got into gamma ray oscillations and how that is...
Just gamma oscillations. Not gamma ray.
Okay, gamma oscillations.
Yeah.
40 hertz that put our minds in the ideal conditions for the thalamocortical columns to communicate with one another. We talked about how DMT affects the brain. Jordan talked about action potentials, 5-HT2A receptors, which are serotonin receptors that also receive the psychedelic drugs and give us an experience. We talked about perturbation brain patterns, and how when our brains are disrupted from their regular activity, new information can be gated from other higher dimensions into our brain and give us a completely new world. And we talked about how there could be a cosmic game going on, and how DMT might be a technology implanted here by higher intelligence for us to be able to discover that there are higher dimensions when we reach a certain level of consciousness that would allow us to synthesize DMT and make it into a more pure state and smoked, so we can peer into other dimensions. One last thing I want to bring up is, why would our hardware in our brain be this way and allow us to have these experiences if we weren't meant to have them? I would just like to ask you that and maybe ponder that.
Mm-hmm.
The only explanation that I can come up with is we were meant to discover this. We were meant to have this intrinsic data that is able to receive from multiple dimensions so that we can peer into them, because there's more to this reality than what the 3D shows us, and we're meant to have insights beyond the outer 3D world that we see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that could be the case. I don't necessarily believe the contrary that I'm going to propose, but like the classic scientific response, like that scientists would put forth, would be that it's just like sort of an illusion or like a coincidence. Like there's nothing special here. This is all just kind of a process of what our brain currently is, and when the drug interacts with it, it kicks it into a completely different state, but it's still within the laws of physics and whatnot. I don't know which side I'd lean on there, but yeah, I don't know. I don't really have a way to know with that, but it's interesting to think like towards your thinking. It's more interesting that way than just thinking it's like some accident of the brain. But I don't know. I personally,
yeah, I understand that. And science is very good at drawing conclusions based off experiments, which are very valuable, and I respect that method of observing our reality. Experiments are great. But experiments are typically done by using instruments, and that can only tell us so much. Our experiences, though, allow us to be an active participant in our reality rather than just observing what is here. It allows us to legit get into what our reality is, get our hands dirty. I know scientists, you could argue, are doing the same thing through experiments, but experience is a very valid method of learning about our reality with. And the only way to really learn about what DMT and other psychedelics is, the only way to truly learn what's going on, I believe, is to experience. And of course, we can have the experiments to support the experiences being had. So we can have the EEGs reading the brain when we go through the psychedelic trips and whatnot. But the most insightful people of these subjects are going to be the people that have the balls to just go and be those psychonauts and be the pioneers in extracting the wisdom that there is to be gained from other dimensions of reality. This has been Inner and Outer Worlds with Zach and Jordan. We appreciate you guys sticking around for the long haul with us, and we hope you gained higher understanding and deepened understanding of your inner and outer worlds and how they are constantly creating the world that you perceive.